Well, good afternoon, everybody. It is 1:57 here on the west coast of the United States of America. I hope that you are doing well. Hit that like button, folks, as we get going today. As you can tell, I'm wearing a sweater because it's a bit on the chillier side, and it's sunny, but it's windy here in Southern California. It's very windy. Yesterday was kind of insane windy. And in my office, it was even colder. So, put on a sweater. I thought I'd be prepared for the night because it's going to be cold, I assume. It's Monday. We want to start off the week well by studying the Bible, but studying the Bible with some folks that we're not used to studying. Well, at this point, we are used to them. If you've been watching this channel and you've been watching the responses we've been doing, this is part 12 of the Exodus studies. And I'm not going to waste too much time. I'm just going to jump into it because, these things go for about 2 hours. And so we want to be definitely give us enough time to be able to respond to them and all that really good stuff. Hope you're doing well. Again, go ahead and hit that like button as we jump into this. I'm getting my Bible software open, ready to go, my Logos Bible software. And I just assume that people are going to join us as we move into this. So, move my mic around a little bit, so I don't know how the audio is coming through. So if you guys let me know how the audio is coming through, if that's good for you and it's of the quality it should be. There we are. Should be fine, I think. I was trying to kind of go at this direction and see if there was a difference. I think that's much better. I like that angle. So, problem is that I can't move around too much, I guess. And have you guys here. I gotta like lean in like this and speak to you. Okay, so we are going to put this at 1.25 the speed, and audio volumes ready to go. Here we go. Lead us away.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 12 of the Exodus Seminar. I'm pleased to note today that we have two new participants, Ben Shapiro and Greg Hurwitz. Greg was with us before, walking through Exodus in the first 8 sessions, some of the first 8 sessions, but Ben's a new entrant onto the scene, and we're very much looking forward to his participation today. So welcome, gentlemen. Glad to see you again, Greg. We're very happy to have you here, Ben.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right. We move today from elaboration of the law to elaboration of the details of sacred space, ritual, and worship. And so we open with Exodus 24. I'm going to read the first 8 verses of Exodus 24. We're going to pause then for an analysis, and then we'll move to from verse 9 to verse 18. So Exodus 24. And he said unto Moses, Come up unto the Lord, thou and Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship ye afar off. And Moses alone shall come near the Lord, but they, the others, shall not come nigh, neither shall the people go up with him. And Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord, and all the judgments. And the people answered with one voice and said, All the words which the Lord hath said will we do. And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord, and rose up early in the morning, and builded an altar under the hill, and 12 pillars, according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the children of Israel, which offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen unto the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. And he took the book of the covenant and read in the audience of the people. And they said, All that the Lord has said will we do, and be obedient. And Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, Behold the blood of the covenant, which the Lord hath made with you concerning all these words. So, Jonathan, maybe you can start us off.
I think Oz, in this part, Oz should start with this, because I know this is what you're really passionate about. And then I'll do the second.
Well, I love this section because covenantal freedom begins with freely chosen consent. And the earlier consent, as Dennis pointed out, they hadn't seen the terms. But this time you have the second and third remark. All the Lord says, we will do. But they've heard the terms now. So they're signing on at the end of hearing the terms. And you have, this is the origin of the consent of the governed.
Mm-hmm. And that's repeated twice,
history.
that the people say that they will do the words of the Lord. So, okay, and we also have the notion here that there's a differentiation of approach to God, that Moses gets to come the closest. There's elders that are in a secondary place, and the people below that. What do we make of that?
Yeah, we'll see that in the second part. It becomes even clearer, because as they go up the mountain, the elders stay there, and then, you know, I forget there's someone else within, they stop, and then Aaron stops too, and Moses ends up alone in the mountain. And that becomes an image of what the tabernacle looks like as well. It's a structure of quantity to quality, many to one. It's the mountain itself, you could say, repeated in different ways.
And it's a differentiation of ethical status in relationship to the highest unity? Is that?
I mean, or you could see it as functional in this case, you know, I don't know. But in terms of experience, that would be it. It would be about attention to the highest thing.
What you'll see in a second, actually, when we get to what happens when they go up on the mountain, is it's almost a foreshadow of what's about to happen afterward, because God specifically says you're supposed to striate yourself as you move up the mountain. And instead, what we'll get to in a moment, is they actually all sit there together, and they kind of disobey God. They don't actually just stop. They kind of sit there, and they eat, and they drink, which we'll get to in a second. And pretty much everybody in this particular situation ends up the worst because of the arrogance of not recognizing their role in that hierarchy, right? We'll get to that in a moment. There's one other thing here that's really fascinating. That's the distinction in Hebrew between the two commitments that the Jews make to, the Israelites make to God here, right? So the first time in I believe it's verse 3, where it says, all that the Lord has spoken we shall do, right? So they hear and then they say, we'll do it. The second time, which has become, in the Jewish community, this is a very big thing, is the phrase na'aseh v'nishma, meaning we will do and we will hear. So what does that mean, right? Shouldn't you hear and then you'll do, right? If we're talking about consent of the governed, shouldn't you actually hear the terms of the contract before you buy into it? Instead, it's not said, right, we'll do, and then subsequently we'll hear. And so I think the idea is that the Jews are now buying into not just the covenant that they've consented to, but into a system that is going to move beyond them. That the system doesn't, what you consent to in life is not just the system that you hear about, right? None of us are born into the idea of a freely consenting people that kind of creates a body politic is a Lockean myth. In reality, you're born into a system, and that system pre-exists you, and it's going to bind you, even though you haven't fully agreed to be a part of all the subsequent changes to the system.
And so in some ways, their covenant is to God, not to the law just on its own. So because they're giving their covenant to God, they're willing to move.
Right, but you're going to command us in the future. We're going to do,
exactly.
Right? It's not just right. They're buying into the system, which is actually really an important thing, because I think
so the spirit as well as the law.
Right, and the tendency in modernity is you don't buy into the system, right? If you don't like the system, you don't like the product of the system, you get to rebel against the system. But the idea is that systems exist as homogeneous wholes to a certain extent, and you get the good along with the bad. So whenever you commit to a system, you have to commit to the good as well as the bad of the system. You don't get to pick and choose.
Hi, everybody. I've invited Douglas Murray and Bjorn Lomborg and Jonathan Pageau, who are three of the most admirable and deepest thinkers I know, to join me on stage to talk about a vision of the future that isn't based on apocalyptic fear-mongering.
It's an interesting commercial to put right there. Not a bad idea.
Which, as he pointed out, it seems opposite. It should be in the reverse order. But of course, like in English, hear also means understand. Do you hear me? A parent says to a kid. It doesn't mean, are you orally capable of taking in my words? Do you understand me?
Oral.
And it's central to my whole view of life, which is a behaviorist view, and it's taken from the Torah, that you act and then you understand is very much the way it should be in any arena of life. I wrote a book on happiness. One of my biggest theses is you want to be happy, act it. Then you'll be happy. Don't wait to be happy to act happy.
Okay, let's think about that a little bit. It seems to me that this goes against conventional wisdom of sorts, right? That you act and then you understand. I would say this would be my problem with most people, is that they act without understanding first. And that's a problem. I get what they're saying. I perceive and understand what they're saying. So I'm trying to conceptualize this and think about it biblically. So the Bible says, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. That seems to me that there's an understanding that happens in relation to God, that God is the sovereign, that God is due, say, respect, honor, worship, whatever may go alongside the fear of the Lord. And wisdom would be, let's just say, knowledge applied, just to make it simple. But so the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. That seems to be an understanding there, rather than you just do a bunch of stuff. And I'm a bit uncomfortable with the two Jewish guys speaking on this. So it's Dennis Prager and Ben Shapiro, partly because I think they're actually reading their tradition, their Jewish tradition. They're reading into the text. I don't think they're doing their hermeneutics properly. So all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar. Yeah, I'll keep it there. I think they are reading their kind of tradition in the way that Judaism is passed down and the sort of commitment they got to have to it. Because there's individuals and I've heard this from various people, where like you just even keep your ceremony. It's a part of your cultural identity. As a Jewish individual, and it's sort of in a weird way even disconnected. And I know this is not the ideal, like I get it, but in a sort of way it's also disconnected from whether like you believe in God or not. I'll give you an example. When I was in Bible college, we had a guy that came and spoke in our class who was a Messianic Jew, which means he's Jewish, ethnically Jewish, believes Jesus is the Messiah. He said that growing up he wasn't in any way an observant Jew. He didn't care about the stuff. He was an atheist, lived his life like a heathen, and he would regularly get invited to his grandmother's house for Passover. Specifically, he was there to speak to us about the Passover. He said he became a Christian, and because he became a Christian and started following God actually and Jesus the Messiah, he was completely excommunicated, never invited to his grandmother's house for Passover. Now, I'm not saying this is the case in every single Jewish home or whatever like that. What I'm saying is that they cared less about, his family cared less about his actual belief and commitment to God, and more about just, hey, you identify as such, you're at family, this family gathering, this is our tradition and stuff. He becomes a more biblically reverent individual and wants to follow Jesus as the Messiah and gets completely excommunicated. Those are the stories where it's in my backdrop and I hear these sorts of things and I go, And I know these two gentlemen sitting here, Dennis Prager and Ben Shapiro, have quite a bit of respect for Christians. They work with Christians. They know what's going on. But I wonder how much of that is reading into.
I would say the same with religious. You want to be religious? Act religious. Then you'll be religious. Don't wait for some road to Damascus moment.
It's a tenet of behavioral psychotherapy as well. The psychoanalysts aim more for like radical and global conceptual transformation, but the behaviorists say incremental progress at the level of behavior will produce psychological transformation. You can see that there might be a reciprocal relationship there. Sometimes you're going to shift conceptually, but a lot of the time you have to practice to become what you want to become, and that's to instantiate it in behavior before you've actually hit the target.
The 12-step program puts it, fake it till you make it.
There's I heard a sort of a beautiful take on the Hebrew with regard. So in Hebrew, the word for taste is the same as the word for reason. Ta'am is both taste and reason. So the question is, what do those two things have to do with one another? And so Rabbi was explaining to me recently that just as with food, the nourishment is primary and the taste is secondary, but gives you added enjoyment. So too with your behavior, it's the nourishment that you get from the behavior that's primary, and it's the rationale that's secondary. And in modern society, we've reversed that. Right? The idea is that if I can't rationalize it, then it's something that I ought not do. And so
this is the sort of thing that I don't think it's either or. I think in people's practical, depending on the way we're wired. So if you came to me and told me to do a bunch of stuff without explaining it, I just wouldn't do it because it needed to make sense to me before I did it. But I also see predominantly individuals who were raised in the church and became Christians. For them, it was putting into practice, and they kind of find their identity and find their faith and discover Christianity is true in a certain sense within that spectrum. So I think both are true. This is not an either or distinction here. I think both are true. It really depends on persons. That's what it really comes down to in my mind.
The idea of accepting received wisdom or received tradition and just doing it because it's accepted and received tradition, and then later you understand exactly what it was that you were doing, has gone out of vogue, and that's a very, very dangerous
thing.
thing.
That's tied in with the idea of faith, is that you evince a necessary faith to move forward in action upon occasion before you understand. And the question then, of course, is what should you have faith in that would allow you to do that? But certainly, like in a behavioral therapy session, for example, what you do with people is you say, well, you agree with them, by the way, because it's consensual. It's not advice from the psychotherapist. It's joint strategizing. Why don't you go out and try this for a week and come back and report about what happened? And then the faith element is the fact that the person will actually go out there and try it, even though they don't have the evidence that would allow them to conclude to begin with that that's the appropriate course of action. So
my favorite William James quote is, act like the person you want to be.
Right, right.
And it's so powerful. And there's so many aspects of this. Talking about, we've talked in the last session about how so many aspects of the story are procedural. First you do this, then you have to do, so you have to put yourself in a position to be able to hear. You have to put yourself in a position to be able to understand.
Well, that'll be a nice transition into the latter part of this discussion today, because we're going to talk a lot about the importance of ritual and transformation. Nietzsche said every great man is the actor of his own ideal. Right, and so the ideal, the acting out of that ideal precedes the transformation of the person into that ideal. And I suppose the ideal is then what the person has faith in to begin with to motivate the action forward. But the transformation is a consequence of the action. You see this too practically, You'll see in your life often, you see this with young people, is they make a transition in status and then they feel like they're frauds. People often experience this if they get into a selective graduate school or a selective undergraduate institution. They think, well, I shouldn't have been selected here. And the proper response is, well, yeah, really, you shouldn't have been selected here. What the hell do you know? But if you practice assiduously, you'll become what you're being enticed to be. You don't have it right off the bat. You have to act it out. So
you see this with Aristotle. I mean, the famous line, you are what you repeatedly do. The importance of habit in moral formation and development of character.
Right. Well, and we could point out there, too, that's also true physiologically at the deepest of levels. I mean, first of all, if you repeat an action repeatedly and the action is successful, you get a dopamine kick from the success, and the dopamine makes the cells that instantiated that behavior grow and thrive and become more dominant. And so that's one way that habit transforms character. But another way is that if you act out a certain pattern, so imagine this, and this is more speculative, but there's good data to support it. So imagine that you continually practiced voluntarily confronting things that you were afraid of, but that you needed to do. And you did that in faith, that voluntary confrontation would be redemptive. That catalyzes genetic transformations, right, at the micro level in the DNA itself that code for new proteins that help instantiate that entire pattern of behavior as an integral part of your psychophysiology, right, all the way down to the cellular level. So what you act out can transform. And then there's even evidence, this is absolutely wild, there's evidence that some of this has an epigenetic consequence, so that not only are you transforming the manner in which your own genes express themselves and what proteins they're coding, but that can have an effect on subsequent generations. So that's wild, and that's something that's only been discovered in about the last 20 years. So we also have an echo here, I believe, in the idea that God is calling to Moses to come up the mountain and then differentiating this authority. It's an echo of the way Jethro has told Moses to differentiate the Israelites when Moses is being tempted by becoming something like a pharaoh earlier, right? So it's this differentiation of responsibility that's a way of mediating between God and man, providing the proper hierarchy of authority so that there's a Jacob's ladder.
Yeah, and you can see it. I mean, it's like the whole text is built that way. That's why it repeats so much, is because it sets up the situation and then it gives you a slightly different version of the same thing, which is, here's God above, too far above, you could say. Here are the people below, which are not yet completely a people. Now, what does it take to connect them together?
Right.
It takes the law, and then it takes a differentiated law, then it takes ritual, it takes a hierarchy of authority. All these things are kind of repeated over and over. The text is built that way.
Right. Well, we need to hammer this home because this is part of the elaboration of the principle of subsidiarity, and that principle is actually put forward in this text as the eternal antidote to fractionation in the desert and an incoherent plethora of subjectivity, you might say. That would be the Israelites squabbling away in the desert and worshiping false idols, and the alternative, which is a unidimensional top-down tyranny. But this is the alternative, this subsidiary structure. And so, and it seems to me that that's technically right, is you need some structures of governance to order your society, but the problem with governance is that you develop the emergent problem of the tyrannical king, and the antidote to the tyrannical king is the distribution of sacred responsibility at multiple levels of the hierarchy, from the divine to the individual, right? Individual, family, community, state, and then perhaps all ensconced within something approximating religious vision. All of that has to be fleshed out.
So I'm wondering, so in our Aristotle that James and I like to talk about, he says that choices are more influential over our character than actions. It's not what you do, it's what you choose to do, and the reasons why you choose it. And so for these Jews to become a people, they have to choose it, don't they? And that means that it's not just doing the same thing over and over again, it's doing it for a reason. Then it has an effect on you.
Very
So
interesting.
it's a tricky thing to differentiate.
Which is to say that it's less genetic. It's less about being a biological offspring of Abraham. It's less about being a biological offspring of Jacob. And we see this in the Bible. We see a number of people who come into very prominent aspects of the Bible who choose to follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Between choice and action, because imagine that one of your choices might be what you choose to direct your attention to. But the reason that's tricky is because that's actually an action. Because to attend to you, I have to move my eyes to you. There's actually it's not obvious at all that there's any level of neurophysiological analysis where choice is separate from action of some sort. So it's micro-actions, as we would conceptualize it as something like choice. It's more like micro-action.
There's always a physiological context.
Yeah, well, even in sense perception, because you think, well, you just look at something. It's like, no, you don't. No. Your eyes are moving constantly. No. If they ever stop moving,
there's a whole causal nexus between the
It's
perceiver
always
and
exploration. Like sense data is almost always like exploratory touch. You have to grip the object with your eyes in order to feel it out. And there's no real distinction between perception and action when you do a microanalysis. And so what we have is something like a hierarchy of attentional prioritization that's then tied to action. And that's a fractal structure too. It's not like there's perception and action. They're intermingled at every single level of analysis. So,
but what about a big action, right? I'm going to walk across the desert. That's a big choice. You might not make it. But if you make it, the claim of Aristotle, for sure, who's a pretty tricky guy, is who wrote, by the way, the first book called Psychology. His argument is choosing to do it is more influential upon your being than doing it.
Well, okay, so I think perhaps a way to conceptualize that is that imagine that choosing to walk across the desert is an aggregation of a multitude of actions. And that's all differentiated, because to walk across the desert, you actually have to move the muscles in your legs like one by one, and then in concert with each step. So there's a whole hierarchy of action under that. And you can switch the direction of that whole hierarchy of action. And when we see someone switching the direction of a whole hierarchy of action, we would say that it's something like a higher order choice. So
you could see it as the covenant itself, and so that's why it starts with the covenant. It's like you have to choose to do this, even though you don't understand all the little details. Because walking across the desert, you don't know exactly what that means until you do it. And so there is a relationship between the covenant, and then after that, there'll be the embodiment in worship and in ritual and all these things, which will train you to make that real for you. Because you can choose to do something and not do it. Because, I would love to go to the gym every day, and I choose to do it, and then that doesn't happen.
Well, and there are some experiences that are so transformative that it's actually not possible to make a fully rational, fully informed decision about whether it's the right thing to do. Getting married, having a child. Everything transforms you so much in your whole cognitive and affective outlook on the world that you can't actually project yourself forward beyond the transformative experience to decide whether or not it's the rational thing to do.
Well, first you do, then you learn.
Well, that also brings up, I would say, something like an observation on the necessity and
it seems to me that they're leaving out very important human dimensions of trust. Because getting married is not an action like going to the gym. Getting married is trusting an individual in front of you who's going to trust you back. Going to the gym is nothing like that. I still don't know what this has to do with the text, by the way. We're about 21 minutes in and really haven't, I guess like it's loosely connected. But again, this is normal for these studies.
Absolute inevitability of something approximating faith. Because the rationalist types who believe that you would derive the impetus for your action from the evidence fail to contend with the fact that much of the time you're literally leaping into the unknown. And what you do when you get married, what you do when you take a new job or move to a new city is you decide you're going to do that, and you presume that you're going to make it work as you go along. And that means you're having faith in something, right? It might be with your wife, it might be your faith in your joint negotiating skills.
So this is what I was talking about. If they keep using this word faith. The Bible uses the word faith as trust, and so we should as well. I don't know how they're using it. They might be, in my opinion, misusing that word. But it's trusting. That's what it really comes down to.
Or more profoundly even, I think, is your faith in the goodwill and honesty of your partner. And you might say, well, you don't have faith in that. It's like, well, yes, you do. And you either have faith in that or you have faith in its alternative, which is the lack of that in anyone.
Lots of commercials today, huh? So let me know what's going on, guys. What do you guys think about what they're saying?
Move. I mean, any more than than the whole law itself is in the context of I'm the Lord your God that led you out of Egypt. And so there's already been a revelation of God's goodness. That is the you might say the precipitating factor to give the confidence to take the step into what is nonetheless unknown. Just as when you marry someone, it's not a blind choice. You think you have some sense that this person is capable of hopefully honoring the vow that you're about to take, and then you say the words, for richer, for worse, for better, for worse, and exactly the way Ben was saying. You don't know what that's going to mean, how poor you might get, or what sickness might be coming around the corner. But you're not. I don't think it's true to say that this is simply will before knowledge.
No.
There's a knowledge that is incipient and partial that gives you the light to take that next step, and then the action opens up further knowledge.
It's a willful subordination to a system.
Yes.
Right? I mean, I think that one of the pieces of language that keeps appearing in the section that you just read is the word blood, right? This is talk about blood of the covenant, blood of the covenant, blood of the covenant, which is obviously a reference to circumcision. Right? It clearly is a reference to circumcision. I mean, it actually harkens back to the language that the Bible uses a little bit earlier in Exodus, where it's talking about this bizarre circumstance where Moses is coming out of Midian and suddenly...
Clearly it is about circumcision? The blood of the covenant would be when the people made a covenant with God in regards to the Exodus story and them leaving the Passover meal. There's bloodshed there. Ben could be right about this. But it's just he's very confident that it has to do with circumcision. I don't think textually that's what's going on. Okay, so let's look at the text. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it on the basins, and half the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it. There's blood being shed. I'm going to disagree with Ben here. Verse 8, and Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant. Okay, Mr. Shapiro. Ben, I don't think you know what you're talking about in all respect. He literally takes the blood that was sacrificed by these animals and throws it on the people and says, this is the blood of the covenant. I don't know how this can clearly be to circumcision. It's in the text.
He's accosted by an angel who says, you didn't do the circumcision on your son, and his wife has to his wife has to do the circumcision. And so the question there is, why doesn't Moses just do the circumcision? Like, people have been doing this for a long time, and the idea is, the tempting idea is that once you've reached a certain spiritual level, you no longer have to reify yourself in the here and now. You no longer have to you no longer have to take the ideal and make it real in your life with the kind of bloody and hard action that it takes to make the ideal real in your life. And so that's what God is reminding Moses there. That's why he's called the bridegroom of blood in that particular section. Same thing here, right? You have Moses who is taking the blood and putting it in bowls, and then he's sprinkling it all over the people, and he's saying this is a covenant of blood. Right? The idea is that he's essentially circumcising the nation here. He's saying that you have now been called to instantiate in your own flesh, in all of your decision making, in every area, the reality of the ideals that you have just been given in the law.
So is the use of the blood here something like a reminder, a very concretized reminder to the people that all the steps, even the micro steps they take forward in relationship to this covenant, are essentially going to be sacrificial? Because the idea, of course, would be if you're moving towards an ideal, that takes work. It takes the willingness to sacrifice the impulsivity of the present to the future ideal, the movement towards the promised land, and that every single one of those steps is in some sense sacrificial. And so maybe that's part of the symbolism.
And that sacrifice also makes you into a nation, meaning that it was fascinating. I went to a circumcision. I went to a circumcision ceremony for an ATL baby fairly recently at the synagogue. And the phrase that's used right after you circumcise the baby is that the baby should go on to Torah, to learn Bible, to the chuppah, to get married, and to good deeds, lemaisim tovim, and doing good things. So from the very earliest, the very first thing you do with the baby doesn't have a name, by the way. We don't name male babies in Judaism until the actual circumcision. Once the circumcision happens, you have now been instantiated into the nation, and that comes complete with the commandments that are now incumbent on you immediately. And this idea that kids are sort of free-range chickens and you just let them do whatever they're going to do doesn't exist in Judaism, and it doesn't exist in the Bible either. So when the people buy into the idea of a covenant of blood, they're pre-committing.
Yeah, that's just not in the biblical text. It could be a part of the Jewish heritage and whatever traditions. And again, as a Christian, I'm going to look at this and say there's quite a bit of stuff that are traditions that Jesus really looks down on and says you guys are more committed to the traditions of your fathers. And I think that still stands true today of committed Jews. Is I think sometimes they will look past the biblical text or will justify certain other actions that aren't in the biblical text. And look, it's not enough for you to sit there and say, well, we're the people who got this, so we know what we're doing. Because you could very clearly be doing stuff wrong. Well, how do we know that? We know that, I think, by the criticisms that Jesus brings against them. We know that by the prophetic criticisms that are brought against the people of Israel within the biblical text. So prophets saying, on behalf of God, that you guys have essentially ignored the heart of the law and that your sacrifices are useless to me, that you're bringing against me. Multiple prophets in the Old Testament do this. So there's internal biblical evidence. If somebody wants, even in the Old Testament, if somebody wants to reject the New Testament, I think Jesus' accusations and Jesus' condemnations of these actions are legitimate. And even there's rabbinic writings from, say, the 2nd century, and later rabbis who are saying, yeah, we kind of lost our ways in a number of the things that we were focusing on. This is all about those hedge laws. You come up with those hedge laws that protect you from breaking the law. And I don't think any of these things, hearing from Jewish individuals, that's very apparent to me. I don't know whether it's apparent to them, but it's apparent to me that's still what they're doing. I think that's problematic.
You can try to get away from it, but there's no way to get away from this. You're now part of the covenant, and this is not a breakable covenant. You can't run away from this.
Well, and you surely another precedent too. You have that incident, the bridegroom of blood, but you've also got the covenant with Abraham earlier in Genesis 15. And as I understand it, you Jews can put me right on this, you cut the animals in half, or the birds, and you walk between them as a kind of sign that these which were once united are divided, but you who now make the covenant were once not united, but now you are. And the blood is the life, of course, and it shows you the supreme cost. And
by the way, mirrored in the sacrifice, right? He puts half the blood in bowls and half the blood in basins, right? He's dividing just the same way that it was at the
Well, we should also point out
pre-Trinitarian.
to people who are watching and listening who might be skeptical about the notion of sacrifice, symbolic or otherwise, that you're going to be sacrificing something when you step forward, no matter how you step forward, because you have to eat. And so something is going to die so that you move forward. And you might think of that as as archaic, the recognition of that, but it's not archaic at all, because there is no movement forward without.
This is my issue again. I'm going to come back to it. It's like too quickly into the application. It's symbolic or otherwise. No. Let's read the biblical text for what the biblical text is.
The sacrifice for creatures that have to eat to live. So you're sacrificing to something, whether you want to or not.
There's a wonderful humility and humanness of the way that the Jews keep forgetting everything. There's these miraculous acts, right? And then they completely forget and go do something insane, right? That makes no sense. And so it's like Pajot trying to get to the gym. You know, it's like they want to do it. We're talking about all this stuff. It's so serious. It's so clear. It's a covenant that's so intense. But there's also a lot of room for human error and forgiveness because that's the process that we all embark on all the time. And any new venture, it's funny you're talking about having a baby or a marriage. I had a meeting one time with a screenwriter who wanted to write a novel, and he said, well, I just need you to explain everything to me because I don't like to begin anything unless I know exactly how I'm going to do it and do it successfully. And I was like, well, the only way you can possibly write a novel is to start doing it and to continuously fail and make mistakes. You have to screw it up consistently. That's the process of learning how to write something. But it's very similar in a lot of ways with parenting, with negotiating a marriage, with negotiating any big venture. There's built-in failure and shortcoming and vulnerability and a need to return and to have the faith to the ideal that you first embarked upon and to adhere to that structure.
Well, and if you don't make the proper sacrifices when you're negotiating with your wife, you're not going to get anywhere at all. And the reason I would say that in part is because it doesn't look like there's any learning without the death of some structure of previous learning. So imagine that you come to an argument with a set of pre-commitments, because you do, but there's an error in your argument. What that means is that part of the previous pre-committed argument has to die. And I actually think there's a neurophysiological foundation to that, which is partly why I think you feel pain when you're wrong, is because that idea that you have is a living structure. And now if you want to progress in the direction of the optimized negotiation and say stay in unity with your wife, you have to be willing to let your stupid preconceptions die. And that ties in with Alfred North Whitehead's observation that the reason we think is so that our thoughts can die instead of us. And so you have to enter into a negotiation with someone, if it's a good faith negotiation, with a sacrificial mentality, which is this might require a little blood on my part in order to progress forward. And so,
Jordan, your comment on, you said earlier something, and it's a brand new thought in my brain, and it's simple, I hope not simplistic. When you said something to the effect that when you eat, you will sacrifice no matter what. And I realized it's beyond, of course that's true, and it's all of life. So many young people don't get married, and many, even more than they, don't have children because they don't want to sacrifice their freedom and their independence and so on. But I just realized I have a new answer to all these young people. And that is, do you realize how much you're sacrificing if you don't get married and don't have children? No matter what you do, you sacrifice. If you do nothing, it's a sacrifice.
This is one of the things I used to talk to my clinical clients about all the time when they were frightened of moving forward. It's like, okay, you're frightened of moving forward. You're frightened of putting your CV out to find a new job. Fair enough, man. You have a reason to stick with what you've got. But let's play this out. You're 30 and you're disappointed in your job and you're afraid to let go of what you already have. Let's just play a game for a moment. Now you're 40. And you're a little more bitter, or a lot more, because the job hasn't improved, and you're weaker because you haven't fought back for 10 years, and you're older, and so you're less desirable. It's like, how do you want that? How do you like that for a future? You're going to sacrifice something. In fact, one of the things you might think about life, and this is worth thinking about, is you're going to sacrifice everything. That's coming, one way or another. So you need to decide. Well, I think this is the issue of struggling with mortality itself. You owe God a death. In service of what? Well, you might say it's going to be in service of nothing, and then I would say that's going to be one painful travail. So
and the sacrifice that is the most meaningful and can lead to the most profound change is generally the thing you can least afford, right? It's a fattened calf in a time of drought. You have to give up the thing that you hold to be so important because it's blocking you from other things.
Well, that's why it's a lamb and not a goat. Right?
Yeah.
It's I mean, in sacrifices, it's a precious animal.
Right.
And I'd just like to stress, well, just maybe 2 points. One, just that the etymology of the word is the making sacred. So there's a positive story here, which is linked up to the very notion of the sacred. And you could say that one of the great shifts in the modern period has been, obviously, the erosion of the sacred. And one of the most significant philosophers as a critic of the modern age was the, I think, often misunderstood Joseph de Maistre with his elucidations on sacrifice. And he was a great critic of the French Revolution. He was a great critic of the secularism of the French Revolution. And he saw the absolute key to the struggle between, as it were, the inherited ancient and medieval structure of Europeans and the new world, the brave new world that was emerging with the French Revolution, as linked to this idea of sacrifice. Now, whether that's obviously one could debate about it.
So if we're consigning what we eat to a purpose, we're making a sacrifice, and then you might say, well, you're either going to consign what you eat, what you consume, what you kill to something profane, or you're going to consign it to something sacred. Those are really your options. And to make sacred would be, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, to justify the necessity of taking that life as well. And so then, and you might ask yourself too, practically speaking, I mean, if you had the choice, wouldn't it be the appropriate thing to do to make every decision that you need to make in light of the highest possible aim? I mean, isn't that exactly the same as trying to put your life in order in the best possible way, especially in relationship to your long-term self, but also in relationship to other people? How is that any different? And so why wouldn't it be that you'd want to make the proper sacrifice constantly?
Well, Mestre has two very interesting points, and I think they're pertinent to our discussion here. And one is, first of all, is a critique of the utopianism of the French Revolution. So he says, look, talking to the sort of French elite, your beautiful meals, these are all, of course, the products of the slaughter of these animals. Your beautiful ladies' dresses with the whale bones and all the elements, again, that are come from these carcasses.
Everywhere.
Exactly. He says, you look at life, you look at society, it's this altar, he calls it, this altar of blood. But at the same time, even though he is critical of the utopianism, he thinks the bogus Rousseau-esque utopianism of the French Revolution, he thinks that they're also missing what he calls the loi d'amour, the law of love, which he obviously sees as the opposite side of, in his case, the Christian religion. So he's and that is where, on the one hand, he's criticizing a bogus utopianism, but he's also trying to present a much higher vision of the potential of life than that being presented by the, generally speaking, utilitarian and materialistic philosopher.
We might also speculate. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of guilt in our culture right now in the West about the blood of the past.
Just a point that this has all been speculation. Look, if you open up your Bible, you go to Exodus 24, it's going to say covenant confirmed. Something to that along those lines in regards to the title. That's because people realize this is a covenantal ceremony that is happening here. The covenant's getting confirmed, and the people are committing themselves to God. Everything else that they're talking about beyond the covenant being confirmed is speculation. And some of it's just wild speculation. Some of it is very blatant eisegesis of reading human experiences into the text. And that's it.
Past, right? We're inheritors of this brutal colonial enterprise, let's say, and we bear that weight upon us. And I have a certain amount of, sympathy for that viewpoint, because history is a bloody nightmare in many, many ways. And then you might ask, well, is the proper response to that a kind of disabling and demoralizing guilt and stasis, which it so often is, or is it a decision to re-sacralize your actions so that everything that you're doing that's a benefit, say, of the privilege that's been accorded to you by tradition is now devoted towards the highest possible end? You can say, well, bloody as the struggle has been to get here, I'm doing everything we're doing everything we can to make the best of that and to devote it towards the highest possible end.
To do that, you have to relinquish self-centeredness, though, because guilt is self-centered.
Why would you say guilt is self-centered?
Because if you're constantly engaged with the history in your relation to it and your feelings of guilt, it's internal, versus to say, here's what I've received, what are the works I should do, how should I carry forth those lessons in a way that can be transformative or positive moving forward. You have to relinquish your self-flagellation in a certain regard.
Can I offer an amendment? Tell me if you accept this. Guilt that you are not guilty of is self-centered.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, I think that,
and that's what we're experiencing
the guilt that you're
today.
guilty of, there's an action that you can take that can set things right from, that's more direct, right? That's right.
I think that also that we should make a distinction here between the culture of guilt and the culture of shame. Right? Those are two very different things. Right? Guilt is generally with regard to others, and shame is with regard to yourself before God. And what religion really is about is shifting the source of your feelings of inadequacy from what everybody else thinks of you to your inadequacy before God, which is really something else. That's really shame. And so we have a culture that's very much focused on guilt, meaning I, as a member of a group, should feel inadequate before members of this other group, which doesn't make a whole hell of a lot of sense unless you particularly have sinned against a member of this other group. But what religion says is something else. It says that you should feel shame because you've fallen short of God. And that shame is something that can drive you to individual action. I think our society is moving back toward almost a pagan sense of guilt rather than the internalized sense of shame, which is what biblical religion is really rooted in, right? It takes all of the sins that you commit against your fellow creature and it says that's not a sin against your fellow creature predominantly. It's a sin against them, but it's also a sin against God, right? It's a sin against something higher. So you should feel ashamed when you sin against your fellow creature, but you should really feel ashamed in front of God for having fallen short. And so instead of your instead of your ruler for feeling bad about yourself being how everybody else views you or feeling bad in front of another group, it's really you didn't do the thing that you were supposed to do, and the standard for what you were supposed to do didn't come from the other group. It came from something higher.
And what's your engagement with God around that shame? How do you transform
So the way that you're supposed to transform that is by going and rectifying the sin that you committed against your fellow human being. Right? So I mean, I'm sure you'll get to when it talks about the Day of Atonement in Judaism, when you atone before God, you're not allowed to ask God for forgiveness for a particular sin you've committed against another human being until you've actually gone and asked the particular human being for forgiveness first. But that's an aspect of atoning before God, is atoning before the person against whom you sin. And we have a society that basically says you never have to atone before God because God isn't there. You have to atone to society at large. And so you see these sort of ritualistic apologies to the world. And it's like, who are you apologizing to, right? Did you sin against that person? Why are you apologizing on social media to people you've never met, who've never heard of the situation until 5 seconds ago when you were apologizing for it? And the answer is that's not how religion, that's not how morality should view sin. Sin is not sin because other people view you badly. Sin is sin because you did something wrong, and the standard for wrong comes from something higher.
Would we be willing to consider the words from those to whom much has been given, much is expected in this light? I mean, we are struggling in our culture with the notion of, let's say, unearned privilege. And we could all say, well, even the fact that we're able to sit here with the electricity on and the air conditioning working and all this remarkable electronics serving our purposes, we're the undeserving beneficiaries of a cultural tradition that's bequeathed to us a treasure, a storehouse of treasure. And that does seem to put upon us some responsibility for moving forward in gratitude for that inheritance. And part of that gratitude, it seems to me, is to be willing to utilize those treasures in the service of something that's high enough that does justify the treasure that we've been given, and that's the proper route towards the expiation of that. You would call it shame, Ben, and that's the escape from it, rather than the shame that crushes and the depression that makes you nihilistic and that demolishes your ambition and all of that. And it looks to me that part of this emphasis in this text on the continual orientation towards the highest possible good at every fractal level of action is part of the acceptance of that cultural responsibility, but also gratitude for what's proper gratitude in the here and now for what's been granted before. I think our culture is remarkably ungrateful, right? Is that we have these remarkable treasures at hand in a manner that's never been the case in the entire course of human history, I would say. And yet we seem to be profoundly ungrateful for that. And that gratitude should express itself in something like the willingness to be of service to the highest within us and the highest between us simultaneously.
I just wanted to pick up on one thing that you said, Ben, about circumcision, which really just lit me up, and I was like, oh yeah, this is amazing. Like, there's a sense in which we see in the sacrifice this hierarchy, the basic hierarchy. So, right, God names man, man names the animals, and so there's just a strict hierarchy of causality and relationship. And animals ultimately in plants become food for man. And so what man is doing.
The naming thing, I wouldn't take too seriously. I wouldn't make that a principle. And depends on how you're defining the hierarchy. Okay, so God names man. And man names the animals. But man also names the woman. And very clearly there's this difference between the relationship of the woman with the man and the relationship of the animals with the man. In that, ontologically, in their being, both the man and the woman are made in the image of God. So they're equals, where the animals are not, and so therefore they're not equals. The other thing is that you see other places where people name God. Hagar is the first person in the Bible to name God. She names him the God who hears, because God hears her pleas and cries. That doesn't somehow make God her subordinate, obviously. So yes, to a certain extent, But I wouldn't make that a principle, because if you make that a principle, you're going to run into some serious issues when it comes to your biblical studies.
Doing is basically taking that which is lower and then offering it up, or like let's say cutting it away or offering it up. There's different ways to represent it in order to gain what is higher. So circumcision, you remove the outer skin to get the central aspect. And then you take the animals and you offer them up. And what's interesting is that if you understand it that way, then all of a sudden when you get to the golden calf, you realize it's exactly what's going on. They are worshiping that which should be sacrificed. They're making into a god that which they should be sacrificing up to a higher purpose.
So one of
there's nothing wrong with a calf.
Yeah.
If you take a calf and you make it into a golden statue and then you worship it, it's like,
so
it's like worshiping all the lower aspects of your life.
One of the things Jung talked about when he described people who were really stuck in this psychotherapeutic practice, so the process of redemption really was that they were unwilling to sacrifice that which they falsely loved the most. And so you might say, well, if you're stuck in your life, the reason for that is that unbeknownst to you, you're worshiping, you're putting in the highest place something that you should not be putting in the highest place. Maybe it even worked for you at one point, but it's time to give it up. And it's very interesting to contemplate this, the potential sacrifice of Isaac in that light. It's that you have to, and maybe it's continually the case, if you're stuck, the rule is you have to find that which you love that needs to be sacrificed, because it's in that love in that situation is indistinguishable from the kind of clinging to, falsely clinging to, that's actually the impediment. So you should always be asking, what is it that I love that I could give up to serve what's highest?
That's what I was thinking about with you sacrifice the thing of greatest meaning, the lamb. So Dennis, to your point, right, I don't want to sacrifice my freedom. Go talk to a young man who's 22. That's everything. It's everything they believe their identity is built around.
By the way, Jonathan, sorry, quick note as far as what you were saying. What you're saying is justified by the text also, because what's Moses' response to the golden calf, which we'll get to? Right? He burns it and then he forces the people to consume it.
Turn it back into food.
Right.
So he offers its essence up to God too in burning it.
Right.
And then forces people to consume it. Okay. Shall we continue? All right. We'll read verses 9 to 18 now. Then went up Moses. This is in order again. Went up Moses and Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu. How do you pronounce that? Does anyone know?
Abihu, yeah.
Abihu. And 70 of the elders of Israel, a subsidiary organization.
Nadab and Abihu are Aaron's children, by the way. We're going to see them later. Well, I don't know. They're not looked at very fondly, I guess, in the biblical narrative, if you know what happens. But, yeah, they're supposed to be Aaron's descendants, so they're the priests. They're with Aaron, and then the 70 elders.
And they saw the God of Israel. And there was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of sapphire stone, and as it were the body of heaven in his clearness. I want to make just a brief comment on that. Precious stones are very interesting if you think about them from a molecular or atomic level, because they're absolutely unitary in their structure. Like a flawless gem has the same microstructure, like it's a repeated crystalline pattern. And because of that perfection of crystalline pattern, it reflects light. And so the idea that, even the idea of a precious stone seems to reflect our innate sense that something that's pure at every level of analysis is valuable, and it's a very interesting juxtaposition of the narrative world and the objective world, that something like that reflects light. It's also interesting that those stones are formed as a consequence of heat and pressure, right? And heat and pressure purify, right? And that's definitely the case in human life as well.
So under his feet, you can understand it that way. It's like, so it's like under God's feet is something which reflects his glory up. There's an image in Revelation which is a similar image, which is the notion that the sea became of crystal. Like under his feet was a sea of crystal. So all this potential below that is messy and it's dirty and it's chaotic, under God, if it's properly ordered and organized, it actually becomes a mirror, like water. If water is still, then it becomes a mirror for light. But if it's turbulent and it's fragmented, then you can't see it. It's messy.
So, and as it were, the body of heaven in his clearness. So,
sorry, but very quickly. This throws up a paradox that is going to be with us when we start looking at the tabernacle. We saw in Exodus 3:14. This is the great revelation of God. I will be what I will be. Which carries with it this notion of divine omnipresence. God is absolutely everywhere. God is not a thing. He can't be represented in any kind of material form. And yet somehow he's got a location. They saw him. They can apprehend him. And it's an interesting tension. And I think the way to resolve it is to think of it in terms of omnipresence, but also kind of manifest presence. So this is the moment at which, as it were, the Israelites kind of tune themselves.
God can localize himself.
Or there's a kind of special intensification of God's presence. Or I don't know, there may be other solutions to it. but how God is everywhere, God is transcendent, and yet, and it's somehow...
But you could understand it like God, that's why it's at the top of a mountain.
Yeah.
Right? God appears at the place where all things come together.
Yeah.
Right? That's the way to understand it. That's why in the tabernacle you have the same structure.
Yeah.
And that can be represented in many ways. Christ often represents it as a seed,
Yeah.
something small, something that's a point, but also contains in it all the possibilities.
Well, I think we have that reflected in our own experiences. So, for example, if you have imagine you have a particularly meaningful conversation with someone. Well, so what's happening? Well, both of you are making the proper sacrifices, so that's happening. Both of you are being renewed, so that's happening. Both of you are coming together as one thing, that's happening. And all of that's a microcosmic vision of that transcendent unity. And then I would say, it's been interesting to talk to people about this sort of thing as I've been lecturing around the world, because I do point out to people that that's actually the ground of the phenomenon of meaning. Like when you're gripped by the sense of meaning in a conversation, it's because that underlying unity to which we're all striving, in principle, if we're striving upward, that principle of unity is action and transcendence and redemption, all of that, death and resurrection for that matter in some real sense. That's all manifesting itself right there and then in that conversation. And I think you can make a case, especially because that's clearly the state you have to be in to learn and grow and adapt, that's the most real thing that can happen to you. If life itself depends on the most intense realization of what's most real, well, that's the most real, and that means meaning isn't an epiphenomenon in the reductionist materialist sense, but it's actually a marker that the transformations of being are taking place.
It just might be because reductionism and materialism is false. That's why you can't do that. It's pretty simple.
In the most beneficial possible manner. Why wouldn't that be the most reliable thing that you have to orient yourself in your life? Everyone wants, they say, a meaningful life. Well, that's maybe because that meaning does reflect something that is truly in the highest place. If people die without it. They're demoralized without it. They're striving towards it. They're in crisis without it. So why would we not consider that real? We're trying to figure out in this discussion what that real might mean. So, all right. And upon the nobles of the children of Israel, he laid not his hand. Also, they saw God and did eat and drink. And the Lord said unto Moses, come up to me into the mount and be there. And I will give thee tables of stone and law and commandments which I have written, that thou mayest teach them. And Moses rose up, and his minister Joshua. And Moses went up into the mount of God. And he said unto the elders, tarry ye here for us until we come again unto you. And behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. And if any man have any matters to do, let him come unto them. And Moses went up into the mount, and a cloud covered the mount. And the glory of the Lord abode upon Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And the 7th day he called unto Moses out of the midst of the cloud. And the sight of the glory of the Lord was like devouring fire on the top of the mount in the eyes of the children of Israel. And Moses went into the midst of the cloud and gat him up into the mount. And Moses was in the mount 40 days and 40 nights.
I think it's
a very
important,
dramatic section.
People just quickly should, those watching or listening, the King James, that they saw God in 11. You can't see God and live. And so they didn't see God. The Hebrew is ambiguous. It's grasp God. One translation is beheld God. But whatever you say, they didn't actually see God.
Yes, that's a really good point, because the ESV actually says they beheld God and ate and drank.
And the Hebrew is not the word to see.
Is there an implication there, Dennis, that because they followed the commandments of God and approached him in the manner that was deemed appropriate by God, that they were able to get closer than they might have normally got closer without being burned so badly?
There's actually two interpretations, right? So in the traditional Jewish commentaries, one interpretation is that they eat, they drink, everything's fine. And then the other one is they committed a major sin, because as we will see, pretty much everybody who participates in this entire process ends up dying, except for Joshua and Moses at the very end, right? So actually, Nadav and Abihu end up approaching God later on in the Bible, and they do so in an unapproved way, because they think that they're closer to God than they actually are, and God ends up killing them with a foreign fire, right? That ends up happening in the book of Leviticus. So one of the reads actually in this section that I think makes some sense is that what's happening here, and it leads up to the golden calf, is that the people are as close to God as they've ever been, and they start thinking that they know more about God than they actually know about God. And so they go up on...
Textually, that doesn't make any sense to me. Textually, there's nothing there to actually suggest they're doing anything wrong. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank. It seems like it's an extra commentary there from, he said there's two interpretations. Yeah, I don't.
on the mountain. They're supposed to, be left behind gradually. Instead, they sit there, they have a big meal, and they have this vision of God in which they see God resting on the sapphire. Now, Jonathan, as you were saying, the sapphire tends to reflect light back up, correct? Right? So, but they think that they're seeing God. What they're actually seeing is not God, right? There's a barrier between them and God. And so they're not willing to acknowledge that barrier. And so this is going to set the stage for what's to happen next, which is they think, okay, well, Moses is gone, right? Moses disappeared, he's up the mountain, as we'll find out, and we can handle this. Right, and God specifically says that they should pretty much stick around at the base of the mountain. They don't stick around at the base of the mountain. They go down back into the people, and the sin of the golden calf
So the lesson is Jews don't give Jews the benefit of the doubt.
So I mean, if you do during the course of the Bible, you're going to end up in the wrong place pretty much every time.
Would we be willing to accept this as a supposition? So there's still the mystery here, I suppose, of why it is that if God is so great and good, that the untrammeled sight of him would be deathly destructive. And I think it has to do with this notion of the cherubim that are set in front of the gates of paradise after the fall that turn every which way and burn. I think the idea is something like nothing that isn't pure and holy can withstand the intensity of the onslaught of God, and that if you approach incautiously, that which is within you that is unworthy will be burned away. And there's a very high probability, given your
symbolic,
infinitely unworthy state, that that'll just be fatal. Well, and so you can think about that practically. Like, you could imagine just for a second that the true depth of your iniquity was revealed to you at once, right? All the cascading consequences of every single thing you've ever did wrong all of a sudden became manifest to you. It isn't obvious at all that anybody could bear that and live. And so...
But you can see it fractally, and you can apply it fractally across all levels, right? A simple example, you have an interview for the job of your life, the one you've always wanted, and then the night before you get drunk, you don't sleep, you don't prepare, then you show up to the interview, and now the ideal that was drawing you forward, that was something you were aiming for, just crushes you.
Exactly.
It'll just destroy you. So it happens fractally at every level, but then this is an image of how that is the ultimate version of that.
Well, the highest ideal is by definition the most intense judge. They're the same thing, right? And then it's also the case that the terror of judgment is precisely proportionate to your distance from that ideal. And if the ideal is the ultimate and receding ideal, there's almost by definition an infinite gap between you and the judge. I mean, part of the reason I think that modern people are so interested in destroying ideals is because they don't, and this is the unconscious motivation, let's say, behind immoral relativism, is they don't want to contend with the fact that you can't have an ideal without simultaneously having a judge. They're the same thing. And so if you can dispense with the judge, well, then it's worth getting rid of the ideal. Then you might say, well, why not just get rid of the ideal? And we're being asked to do that constantly, right? And I think the reason is, well, you can't experience any positive emotion without an ideal, because positive emotion is always experienced in relationship to movement towards an ideal. So if you scrap the ideal, there's no happiness. And then if you scrap the ideal, there's also nothing that unites you, because you need to unite internally around an ideal. And if you're disunited, then you're anxious and chaotic. And if there's no ideal that unites us, then we can't cooperate and compete in peace, and we're fractious and we'll fight. So if you get rid of the ideal, then you lose joy and you invite in chaotic anxiety. That's the price.
And a way to describe it from the text is you could say that's when you wander.
You're right.
That's when
in the desert.
That's when you wander in the desert.
Yep.
You just have no direction. You just kind of go around in circles.
Yeah, right. Well, it's because we could make that more concrete. Why do you have no direction? Well, do you move towards the ideal when you're moving in a direction or not? Well, obviously you do, because why else would you move in that direction? If it's not better where you're going, which is higher, in the metaphorical sense, why would you expend the effort? So no ideal, no direction, no meaning. And the problem with no meaning is that no meaning doesn't mean neutral. No meaning means pointless suffering.
Pain.
Right, there's no meaning. There's just pointless suffering.
Well, that's the point we're raising about sacrifice and necessity. Like, if you leave the authoritarianism of Egypt, the sacrifice you have to make is that you wander. That's the pain you were saying when you have to concede something. You're not delivered immediately into the promised land. So those sacrifices you're making, whether it's in engagement.
This is so beyond what the Bible teaches. It's just fascinating. So, look, the reason why they're in the desert for such a long time is because they disobey, not because there is whatever else they're saying. It's just like when the text tells you something, man, just stick to the text. That trip in the desert is not supposed to be that long. The reason why the Israelites are in the desert for such a long time is because of disobedience. Anything else other than what the text says, I'm just going to throw in the trash can.
with your wife that you give something up, whether it's an AA and you're giving up alcohol, when you're giving up anything that you think that you need, you're immediately lost, because when you sacrifice the thing that's important to you, you don't know what to orient towards, and you have to hold until you can find the next thing
You
to
can
orient
understand
towards.
this too, because you might say, well, if you're having an argument with your wife, why do you get so stubborn? And the answer is, well, you don't want to give up the tyrannical thing that's causing the argument. And then you might say, well, why do you not want to give that up? And you say, well, it gives you some direction, even if it's tyrannical. And when you give that...
Not necessarily. You could be having the argument and you just think you're right.
up, there's going to be a little interregnum in the desert, right? You have to admit that you were wrong. That's annoying. And then you have to not know exactly how to orient yourself, and then you have to conjure up.
Thing's always symbolic of
assuming you're wrong and your wife is right. What if your wife is wrong?
It's like a vein that goes deep in you, right? So it's not over whatever the ridiculous thing is that you're disputing. It's that if you concede that, you're conceding something that goes...
Well, that's another specter, is that, you know, to some degree you're giving up the presupposition that's engendering the argument, but to another degree, the reason you held that presupposition to begin with is because you're actually more tyrannical than you should be. And that's facing a much broader problem. It's not just that you're hard to get along with, it's that you're the sort of person who's hard to get along with. So...
I don't want to add another divagation while we're wandering in these deserts, but I have a question for Ben, actually, about your interpretation. Am I right in thinking that your claim is that there's a sort of anti-Faust going on here? So this is a criticism of this...
they're getting too comfortable with God, right? They get up there, they're eating and they're drinking in front of God. Now, if you're having a vision of the Almighty and you're seeing Him, right, or seeing a vision of Him, would the first thing that you would do pop out the wine and have a feast?
I think what Ben is missing here is that in the ancient Near Eastern world, there are divine meal ceremonies. They're all over the place. As a matter of fact, that's what the Passover is, my friend. You eat with God, essentially. Like, it's everywhere in the Bible. Jews do this on various occasions. Consider the Passover and the way Christians celebrate it in the sense of what we call the Last Supper, which is still Passover meal. In that Jesus says, this is my body, this is my blood. I get what he's saying, but I think he's ignoring the fact that these people would have been used to these sorts of ceremonies. And it seems to me that they're not doing anything wrong, textually speaking, and I think he's reading into the text.
This is another aspect, isn't it, of let's say, traditional cultures. So it's this which again is maybe unfamiliar in the contemporary world, is this this fear of hubris, this fear of arrogance. That, you know, on the one hand there are these ideals that we need and that are constitutive of human happiness, and yet on the other hand there's these taboos around the whole Faustian project of certain kinds of even knowledge that are potentially dangerous and destructive. And that, of course, is often used by critics of religion to say, well, this is the... I
suppose that's a kind of a warped reemergence of the doctrine of humility, and maybe a reflection, too, of the injunction not to use God's name in vain. That's right.
Well, there's that ambiguity in sacrifice as well. I mean, sacrifice is at once a kind of yearning for the divine, and yet also can often express a temptation an attempt to merge with the divine, a kind of sort of bloody-mindedness.
That's right. I mean, the root of the word korban, right, which is sacrifice in Hebrew, is karov, which means closeness. And so the idea is that it's supposed to drive you close, but at the same time, it's distancing you from the divine because it's supposed to remind you of the sins that you've committed. And, you know, this is one thing that's really important, I think, to remember about these particular sections. The sin that, again, it gets repeated later again with Nadav and Avihu, who are Aaron's sons, is that there's a temptation to believe that when you're that close to God, God loves you, you love God, that this means that He no longer holds you by a particular standard, or you're so close to Him that this means that you're allowed to...
Well, the text never really says that. All the text says about Aaron's sons is that they bring fire, or they bring detestable fire, and depends on the translation you're reading, or incorrect fire, or something like that. And therefore, they're judged for it. It doesn't say, oh, they feel too close and comfortable. Like, that's quite a bit of interpretation going on.
Sin, that God loves me so much that this means that He'll totally understand everything that I'm doing. And this is why you have to balance the love of God with the fear of God. And in essence, what you theoretically should be orienting yourself toward is a fear of God that amounts to love of God, because you fear hurting God so much. You fear acting against his word so much out of love of him. But that unity is really hard to discern. And so what people tend toward in particularly a very comfortable time is God loves me. I mean, obviously, look around. The world's a wonderful place. And that means that I can basically do what I want and get away with it. And I think what the language here suggests...
very, like, instead of going into the area that Ben has gone into, like how people think, all you need to do is explain that that's not what love is. Love and acceptance doesn't mean you can do whatever you want to do. So therefore, the people that are acting like that are acting under incorrect presuppositions. That is not what it means for God to love you. Plain and simple. For God to love you and forgive you and accept you means that you live differently, that you are faithful to him.
Yes, it doesn't just say that they're not harmed. The words in Hebrew are that lo shalach yado, he didn't send forth his hand, right? That God doesn't actively smite them at the time. So the idea is God may be holding himself back here, but you are actually, you got to be very careful not to assume that your love of God and God's love of you allows you to bridge the gap between you and him.
I think that's part of the reason why the Protestants, at least certain denominations or expressions of Protestantism, insisted that you couldn't be saved by works. I think part of the idea there is you shouldn't assume that just because things are going well for you that means that you're specially favored or that you're now free to vary.
No, Jordan. Protestants don't believe that because the Bible doesn't teach that.
Vary from the divine order in some manner that you might assuming that you're favored in some way.
That's exactly what we're going to see, I think, later when it talks about Moses asking to see God's face, and God says, no, you can't. Right? If there's anybody who has a right to see God's face by our lights, it would be Moses, right? I mean, he literally, actually at the end of the Bible, it's going to say that he's the only person in human history who spoke to God face to face, right? Is what it says at the very end of the Bible, and it seems self-contradictory, right? That it says that you're not allowed to see God's face, but he spoke to God face to face. Well, you can speak to someone face to face theoretically without seeing them, and the idea is that there is always that gap. Even for Moses, there's that gap. There's no way to fully apprehend God, and God doesn't want you fully apprehending him.
I think that's the significance of the cloud, isn't it? I mean, right. The cloud is both a sign of a reality in which God is present, but it's also what cloaks God is what disguises him, makes him.
And interestingly, the Gnostic sects within Christianity, I mean, those who were claiming gnosis, knowledge, were often antinomians. And so this was, part of the critique of Gnosticism.
Anarchic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, so let's move to Exodus 25 to 31. And this is a tricky part of the text from a narrative perspective because we're starting to elaborate out the notion of ritual and sacred space, ritual, and worship. And so 25 to 31 start to talk about sanctuary. That's the sanctuary of God and human alike, I suppose, insofar as communing with the divine is a form of sanctuary. And it opens up with a description of offerings. And so the people are asked to contribute gold, silver, brass, blue, purple, and scarlet, linen, goat's hair, skins, incense, oil, and onyx, precious items, precious valuable items, to build a sanctuary for God. And a sanctuary for God, and that's an easy thing to be cynical about for modern people too. It's like, well, does God need a house? It's like, isn't that archaic and primitive? It's like, well, we talked about already the fact that the Spirit of God that's presented in Exodus has a vertical element and a horizontal element. It's like, well, you need a dwelling place, at least so people can gather together, and a people is a people who gather together, and a people also has to be a people who gather together in the service of some higher order. Yeah. And so how are you going to do that without a place to do it? And this is also the foundation of the idea of the church itself.
It's similar. The church is a little different. We could, if we want, we could explore that. Maybe it's a good idea to explore this first. Then towards the end, if people are comfortable, we could mention the difference between the way that the tabernacle is set up and our traditional church is set up.
Okay, do you want to start with a description of the tabernacle?
Well, I mean, I think the important thing to understand is what we've seen now until now is basically now being very much repeated in space. And so the mountain and just the subsidiary structure, a structure of creation, is being repeated in the way the tabernacle is set up. So the tabernacle is not set up in an arbitrary way. It's set up in a series of hierarchical spaces where quantity moves to quality, all the way from the let's say the gathering of the people, then you have the strangers outside, the gathering of the pure people inside, and then the priest in one space, and then the high priest in the high space. So you really have a mountain, if you think about it that way. But the mountain is repeated in the way the tabernacle itself is made. There's a hierarchy of materials, and so gold is in the holier places, then you move out, there's silver on the post, and then the parts that are used for the sacrifice are made of brass. So that's a hierarchy that you'll see repeated in other places in Scripture, such as the statue of Nebuchadnezzar, where there's just a hierarchy of materiality. But it's also there in the way the veils are represented themselves. So you have a veil of linen, then you have a veil of wool, and then you have these garments of skin, which are these hairy garments that are dyed red. And so some of the church fathers, for example, talk about how this would be something like the garments of skin that were given to Adam, like this final covering which is added around the person and is related to circumcision as well. It's related to the notion of the foreskin, which is on the outside. So there's this strict hierarchy that moves all the way up into the central space and then out into the. So just we can start with that because it's really important for people who are listening and watching to understand this. There's nothing arbitrary about the way it's set up. It's set up in the very structure of attention, the structure of participation, which is this subsidiarity and this hierarchy that we've been talking about from the beginning of this seminar.
I'm going to bungle this a little bit because I'm not an expert in this domain, but we have these computational machines now, AI machines, that can classify. It means they can categorize a multitude of phenomena into a unity. And in order for that to happen, there has to be a hierarchy of conceptualization. Now that's hidden in an AI system. We don't know what the hierarchy is, but to get from the multitude of cat pictures, let's say, to the unity of a system that can identify cats, there's all the different pictures of cats that might exist out there in the world. And then there's the concept of cat, which is in some sense Platonic. It's a Platonic unity. And in order for the machine to perform those computations, it has to build a hierarchical structure that reaches towards a unified goal. And those layers are they're invisible in an AI machine because it generates them themselves. But my point is that even to replicate the process of perception and cognition in relationship to a category, which is a kind of ideal, that cannot be done technically without the construction of a hierarchy, a subsidiary hierarchy. It's a necessary precondition for computation, for perceptual computation itself. Now, I haven't got that perfectly right, but I know there's an analogy. I know there's a deep analogy there in that the perception of something, like as simple as a drinking cup, it's a perception that's based on the bringing together of a multiplicity of potential forms, all the different cups there might be, into the unity of what constitutes the cup. And to do that requires a hierarchy of differentiation of this sort.
And the structure has, I mean, there's so many elements. We could name many, but a simple one is that when we talked about the two pillars, the pillar of water, the pillar of cloud, and the pillar of fire, well, then this now gets captured in here as well. You have the altar of sacrifice, which is this fire going up. Then you have the water, which is to cleanse. There's many, many versions. And the way to structure it in your mind is that on the outside of the holiest place, you burn the animals and you offer it up. So you can imagine, right, the cloud of smoke going up into the heavens, and then on the other side, in the western house, then the glory of God descends. So it's like it's annoying to see it as a transaction, but it's like if you give up the sacrifice, then you will receive the purpose, you receive the glory, which will descend on the body.
Well, here's a way of thinking about that. So imagine this might constitute a useful prayer. Let's say you're in despair, to the point where you're depressed, you're anxious, you're ill enough to see a psychotherapist. Well, one thing that you might do is begin with an offering. It's something like, and people do this automatically. They say, well, what is it that I might be doing wrong, right? And Rogers, for example, pointed out that before you could enter into the contract of psychotherapeutic transformation, you had to admit that there was a problem and admit that change was necessary. So basically what you're doing is you're approaching the problem of being that can't progress in a spirit of humility, and that's an offering. What am I doing wrong is something like, well, if I could just find out what wrong was, I might be willing to give it up and change. Well, that's a sacrifice. That's an offering of the willingness to sacrifice. And then if people search their soul in that manner, then what will happen very frequently, sometimes in communication with others, but sometimes just as a subjective phenomenological experience, they will get a revelation. Right, and that's echoed in the gospel phrase, that if you knock, the door will open, and if you seek, you'll find, and if you ask, it'll be given to you. It sounds magical, but it's not magical. It's no more than what you always do when you set yourself forward to solve a problem. You first admit that there's a problem. The second is you admit that you have something to learn. The third thing you do is to ask for a revelation of the thing that you need to learn. And maybe you open yourself up to receipt of that in dialogue with someone else, but it's also something that can make itself manifest within. And you might say, well, you thought that up. It's like, that's not really how it works. Is you ask the question, and if you're extraordinarily fortunate, maybe that would mean you were on your knees with sufficient intensity. A redemptive answer will make itself manifest, and that is the offering up, the sacrificial offering up, and the descent of something like the unifying spirit, practically speaking.
So I'll admit, we read the Bible once through, the 5 books of Moses once through every year. So I've been doing it for, since I was like 12. So we've been doing it for quite a while. And these are always the boring sections of the Bible, right, where you get the very, very detailed descriptions of the tabernacle. And then, as we'll see, we actually end up doing it twice.
Yeah.
And I will admit that I did not understand, actually, I think, what was going on with the tabernacle until I read Maps and Meaning. The reason was, and forgive me, Jordan, if I screw up your book here, but when I was reading Maps and Meaning, and the basic suggestion that struck me is when you were talking about the way that children apprehend the world, that they apprehend objects as having values attached to the objects. So when you teach a kid about a glass, you don't teach them, here's a glass, here are the properties of glass. If you drop the glass, it's going to shatter. You say, don't touch the glass, right? Don't touch the glass because it'll break, right? And that's how you learn about what a glass is because the rules come embodied in the object. And in the Garden of Eden, that's also the way that the world is described, right? Don't touch the tree, right? It's the tree of knowledge. You don't touch the tree. It comes with a set of rules. And that also happens to merge fairly well with the idea of the knowledge of good and evil in an Aristotelian sense.
Don't eat from the tree. That's Eve's addition, Ben, where she says you shouldn't eat from it and nor touch it. It doesn't say don't touch it.
Meaning that what is good is that it serves its purpose, right? A good thing is a thing that serves its purpose. So in the Garden of Eden, and this is where natural law springs from, the idea is that the world is created with a sense of purpose, and everything in the world comes with that teleology. It comes with that sense of purpose. And where man fails and is ejected from the Garden of Eden is where he begins to substitute his own judgment of moral good or ethical good, his own judgment of what is good and evil, for the teleological view that God has placed in the world for him to understand. And so as soon as he substitutes his own logic and judgment for that, he has to be thrown out of the Garden of Eden, and the gap emerges between the meaning of the world around us and the meaning that we impose on the world around us. And when it comes to the tabernacle and it comes to this section of the Bible, this is the reimposition of the Garden of Eden, and it's very clear that that's what's happening in the language, right? You can see the words that are used only a couple of times in all of the Bible, right? You're speaking of the skins, right? The orot, right? That are given to the tonot orot, which are given to Adam, the skins that are given to Adam, which make their appearance here again. You see the angels with the swinging swords reappearing atop the ark, right? And so the idea here is that what God is saying is that with the commandments and with the law, I'm reinstantiating the world with rules and meaning that exist in the world, and they've been gone for a long time. And now the law is the way that you're going to be able to re-access a world where the meaning is embedded in the world and not separate from the world, which is why now what's behind the angels, right? But before, what was behind the angels was the Garden of Eden. Now what's behind the angels, what the angels are guarding, are the Ten Commandments, right? It's the luchot, it's the tablets, or what's being guarded. The law is being guarded because that's the pathway back into the Garden of Eden, where the world is invested with a new sense of meaning, and that's what the tabernacle's about.
You have in the tabernacle too, and correct me if I've got this wrong, there's two elements that are being stressed, and I suppose one would be the holiness of the tradition that's carved in stone and is so memorable, but you also have the notion that's certainly echoed in the structure of Christian cathedrals and churches that the proper community necessarily has as its center point the highest possible sacrifice, and that's actually the hallmark of the civilized pattern of interaction that enables you to sustain your own life and sustain the community. And you might
that's actually a difference. That's actually a very important difference between the way that the tabernacle in Scripture is set up and the way that a church ends up being set up. Because the way that the church ends up being set up, and which is related to the problem, or let's say the paradox of Christ, is that the altar and the Ark of the Covenant are fused. And this is something which is not, so when people often say like churches are just based on the Old Testament, it's nonsense. Like we've taken the outer part and then we've brought it into the holy place and we've fused it's three things. It's an altar of sacrifice, it's the Ark of the Covenant, and it's a table of communion. And so it's the table that Abraham shared with the angels. And that's what the altar is in a Christian church. So it's different from here. It is definitely a movement from this, like it's related to this, but it is based in a vision from Revelation. Because in Revelation, it's the Lamb on the altar around which all things turn. And so it's that vision in Revelation which brought Christians to ultimately fuse those together in the Holy of Holies.
Whereas, by the way, synagogues tend to be more structured like the tabernacle, right? You have the Aron, you actually have the Ark up front, and then you have the Bima, which is where you actually read the Torah. That's located kind of in the center of the congregation, which is where the Mizbeach would be.
And would that be related to the altar, like symbolically? Would it be related to the altar?
I mean, it makes sense that that's how it's constructed. I mean, it's literally set up for the reading of the public reading is done in exactly that area, and then you take the Torah out of the Ark and bring it down into the people, and then you read it.
Yeah. I have a question for you and for Dennis. I don't know if there's a tradition in Judaism, but there is in Syrian Christianity and Orthodox Christianity, there's a sense in which Eden is a mountain, and that Eden itself is a mountain. I don't know if this is something that you have.
I hadn't heard that one before, actually.
Well, just because it's like Eden itself is the structure. There's a church father, St. Ephraim the Syrian, who said the Garden of Eden is a mountain whose top is higher than all the mountains and whose base is further than all the oceans. So it's actually the whole cosmos really is what ultimately the Garden of Eden is.
And is there not that strong sense of on earth as in heaven, so that the representation of this
Of the tabernacle, for sure.
Exactly.
That's what's going on.
And
Part
in
of
the
that fractal structure.
Exactly. In the Anglican liturgy, there's this beautiful moment at the point of the Sanctus, where we speak of it, and now with angels and archangels, and it's that, and all the company of heaven. So, i.e., the thought that at that moment, this world that has been alienated from the divine, the heavens are opened. At that moment, there's a part.
What a lot of these guys are missing, like I wish they had mentioned it, and this is the distinction between the Christians that are sitting around this table and the Jews. The reason why the Orthodox have the churches set up and that fusion is going on that Jonathan's talking about is because Christ has brought all that together. We can commune with God. We can walk into the Holy of Holies. We can walk, as the book of Hebrews says, with everything that we have, every need we have, boldly before the throne of God. Where the Jewish guys sitting around this table can't say that. Because they can't. There's still that distinction, right?
Participation in the divine. There's a reconnection after the alienation.
Yeah. We say we who represent the cherubim. We say in the Orthodox tradition, and then it says we lift up our hearts, and it's like that's what's going on. It's like lifting up our hearts so that it becomes the place where God.
So you might tell me what you think of this. Is so that in the holiest of places you put the tradition that guides and unites, and that has been transmitted across time, but you have to conjoin that with the sacrifice.
That's the support, right? So that's why it's in the box. So we should talk about the Ark of the Covenant too. It's like it's a microcosm.
The land of Eden.
So what's important?
so
the glory is
let's go into
not
that.
the box. Like there's what's in the box, and that becomes the support for the glory which descends upon it. So the glory
It's
of
just
God
between the cherubim, right?
Yeah. So the glory of God is actually insubstantial. That's like it doesn't have body. It's light. It's represented as either light or as darkness, as something which is beyond the material world. And so the box, the house, the law, the food, which the manna also goes into the box, is the support on which this functions.
Okay, and that's the contract between man and God and between man and man simultaneously.
So
And that goes into the box.
That way.
And so that's the foundation for what. So let's talk about the Ark of the Covenant. So it's in the holiest place in the.
And it's a microcosm of the whole thing. It's like it's all repeated. It's all the whole thing gets repeated in smaller and smaller instances so that it becomes like the most concentrated version. And so you have this square box, which is equivalent to the tabernacle itself. And there's a relationship between stability and squareness. It's hard because we don't think this way in modern terms, but the ancients used to think that the sky is round, the heavens are round, and the earth is square, right? The heaven is like a dome. It's like this circular aspect, and the world is four directions. It's maybe an easier way for modernists to understand it. So it's the stability. And so now you have this box in which you put the law, you put the manna, and I think there's also Aaron's staff.
Staff, right?
So
that's tradition.
Right, but it's just the tools, it's the method, it's the substantiation of the glory of God which descends upon.
So would you say that's the previous instantiation of the realization of God? That
No,
tradition?
it really is. It's just you could say it's like all the laws are there to show you God.
Right.
It's like God's what's important about this whole thing. It's not the laws in themselves, right?
Right. It's the foundation for the presence of God, right?
That's right.
Is
Yeah,
that,
Right. Well, but they'd also be concretizations of God in some
Well,
sense.
it-
The law is a
God's will.
concretization.
God's
Okay,
presence in the world. God's
but that's
presence in the
already
world.
what's been established, but it's not enough because there has to be a process.
And also the embeddedness of human beings within God's structure. Meaning, one of the things that's sort of fascinating about the way that the ark is constructed is that it's not pure gold all the way through, right? It's gold and then acacia wood and then gold again, correct?
So let me offer a thought that has been central to my understanding of life. Everything is holy in this. The curtains are holy, the priests are holy, the sacrifices are holy. Everything is holy until you get to the Holy of Holies. And what's in the Holy of Holies? The Ten Commandments. So my read is the holy protects the ethical. Our society has completely lost the concept of the holy, and as a result, we have lost ethics.
It's a source of the ethical, you could say.
Oh, I don't say that.
Okay.
I'm okay with it, but I'm saying it very precisely as it protects it. And I always
You
like
mean
to
the
give
outside structure?
No. I'll give you a perfect, what I think is a perfect example. You may not agree. I remember being stunned when people started cursing publicly. Having come from a yeshiva religious background, Ben would have the very similar response, and maybe even someone from a strongly Christian background.
Or someone from my background where just in our culture you didn't cuss. It still fascinates me. I mean, I used to have a very disgusting mouth and tongue. I used to curse all the time. But even when I used to curse all the time, I would only curse around my friends. I wouldn't do it publicly. I definitely wouldn't do it in front of my parents. And I really wouldn't do it in front of other people, in the sense of like older people, so on and so forth. Like amongst peers, I would do it because I had this understanding that this is shameful. I shouldn't be doing this in front of people I respect and look up to. My peers, they're okay. That was just a cultural notion that was like kind of a respect sort of thing that was passed down. This is interesting what he's saying.
We understood people say expletives, etc., but that it became normative in society.
I agree.
To me, that was James Q. Wilson's broken windows. To me, the holy is the window that's broken. When you break the holy, you don't immediately break the ethical. Secular people think we don't need holy stuff. That's nonsense. We just need ethics. But it's not true. That's why I say it protects the ethical. Holy, 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 10 commandments.
You know, I could tell you something interesting about curse words that bears on that. So there's a neurological condition, Tourette's syndrome, that compels people to swear, or it actually disinhibits swearing. And you might think, how in the world can you have a neurological condition that makes you swear? Well, swear words are 4-letter words. They're guttural utterances. You have a different circuit that swears. It's almost the purest combination of unmediated emotion with language. And when you swear, you're actually using the circuit that animals use to signal the presence of predators. So if a jaguar or if a monkey sees a jaguar and it has a jaguar utterance, it's really a curse, and it alerts all the other monkeys to the fact that the jaguar's there, and it has an implication for action. And what happens in Tourette's is the structure that would integrate or inhibit that more primordial linguistic system is not functioning. And so what it means is that as the curse words re-enter the lexicon, it's the collapse of the integration structure that keeps those animal utterances under control. That's literally what's happening.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I'd like to also
Jordan Peterson, in a very long and academic way, said, if you're cussing a lot, you're like an animal. It's your animal instinct. He just called people animals. That's hilarious. But in a very complicated sort of way.
Reason for the jaguar to eat the monkey.
What's that?
That's another reason for the jaguar to eat the monkey.
Because he's being cursed. Yes, absolutely.
I want to give another
They have a different
example.
swear word for eagles than for
In addition to
jaguars.
cursing, I'll give you another, because people need to hear examples, because they don't understand. The secular society has no notion of the holy.
Are these examples of curse words, Dennis?
No, I'm going to another one. San Francisco City Council had a debate a few years ago on whether or not to keep laws against public nudity.
Right.
And by one vote, they voted to keep it, and their rationale was a completely secular one, and that was health. That naked people sitting on a bench, it wouldn't be healthy, and we can't rely on them to all sit on a towel. And so on my show, I said there is only one reason to ban public nudity, and that is that the human being is not an animal. Animals are naked, humans are clothed. That's a religious concept. There is no secular argument against public nudity. Call me up with a secular argument against public nudity. By the way, then, as you know, all the left-wing sites, Prager says...
In favor of public nudity.
There are no... Close, yes. Well, Prager says there are no secular arguments against public nudity. I'm for public nudity, exactly. But it's so important for people to understand. And even my listeners, many of whom have a religious background, it was news to them. Oh, there really is only a religious holy argument against public nudity. Well, there is no
there's an aesthetic
argument.
one, too.
Here's the thing.
Well, okay, fair enough. In some cases.
There's an aesthetic one. Dude, God. Oh, man. Jordan Peterson dropping them bombs.
Dennis, I'll say that it's almost mirroring the gold structure of the ark. Holiness protects the ethical, which does protect the holy in the end. And the reason I say that is because there really is no rationale for any ethical system absent certain core assumptions about the human being, the human being made in God's image, the innate value of human beings. Like once you get rid of that, there's no rationale for any of the ethical systems that exist. And so these are all just assumptions that are made silently by people who deny there's a God, but they're living off the fumes of systems that have been created long before they were created. And so the death of the sacred, I mean, you're totally right about this. It also means the inability to defend society against predations against it on the ethical level, as you're discussing. The proper response to people should be able to walk around naked in the streets is to laugh at that. Right? This is when the sacred is breached, your normal response is to laugh at that because it's absurd. Right? The reason that societies have sacralized, wide variety of societies have sacralized certain behavior is because the idea is that this is not up for debate. In the same way that we have a constitution where certain rights are supposed to not be up for debate. Right? These are self-evident truths, even though they're completely not self-evident. We say they're self-evident because they've now been sacralized in secular terms. Once you do that, once you set aside a series of ethical precepts and you say these are sacred, we're now saying I don't have to re-express to you every single time we talk about this the rationale for this. This is a piece of traditional wisdom that has been accepted as a data point that's been useful for thousands of years. If you're going to put this in the most secularistic of terms, and this data has proved itself valuable and decent and good, and therefore it is sacred. And when you breach it, you're actually doing something wrong. And this is something that Jonathan Haidt talks about: is that the left has no concept, in the modern left has no concept of the difference between the sacred and the profane. But it's something that the people on the right tend to take very, very seriously. And this is seen as sort of ghost in the machine, kooky kind of stuff. But the actual utility of being able to say there are certain first principles that we are not going to argue over. These are just things that exist in the world. And if you breach that, the proper answer to that is not a rationalistic response. The proper answer is laughter.
Well, without that agreement that there are certain things that are sacred, you don't have a community.
Right.
Because everything's up for dispute. You only have a community when some things aren't up for dispute. If we have an agreement, it's because some things aren't up for dispute, right? And we might need a deep agreement to bind us. And if it's deep, the idea that what we've agreed upon has a certain depth, which means it spreads and is effective across a wide variety of situations. There's no difference between what is deep and what is sacred. They're the same thing phenomenologically and conceptually. So,
and that depth is, I mean, you can see it in the structure of the Bible itself, right? The structure of the Bible itself moves from family to tribe to nation under God. Right? And what that is, it's taking the deepest, most profound, sacred thing in everybody's life, which is their family. That is the most sacred thing in your life. It's inviolable. And anybody who tells you they love a stranger the way they love their family is lying to you. They're just completely full of it. And then it moves it up to the idea of tribe, which is still a blood kin tie. And then what religion does, that moves it up to the level of sacred ethical principles that bind entire communities of people. And that allows for the possibility of progress. And there's a social scientist over at Harvard, Joseph Heinrich, who wrote a great book about the weird people, right? The Western educated, industrialized, right? And his basic foundation is that it is the presence of the church and development of religion over time that actually creates the West, specifically because it ends up abstracting ethical principles from belief in God that are now that can now trump things as deep as family and nation. The danger is when you remove God from that equation and the nation becomes the only thing that binds. Pretty quickly, that either falls apart or becomes tyrannical, and that's what we've been seeing.
So, Dennis, to your point about this, it's almost like
none of the stuff we're talking about here has to do with the text. Like, we've left the text. We left the biblical text such a long time ago that I just...
The holy contains, or boxes, like the tabernacle's a box, right? It has to be contained within that in a way for it to exist. And part of, if you remove the holy from the ethical, if you unleash it completely, you see this overgrowth of these ethical debates that feel like these cancerous monsters of people vying for, right? It's Milton's Lucifer, right? It's the intellect that falls in love with itself.
The rational. Right.
And but the rational with the ethical quickly becomes a competition for the most ethical, and then it wraps itself in like status.
Exactly.
It becomes this overgrown cancer where it's like ethics run amok in HR departments, right?
And it's not just the rational. I think that the sacred in the end always returns. There's no kind of sacred free zone, as it were. It's just you'll eventually, a culture that gets rid of the sacred will simply
Smuggles a new one in. Ethics overrun in some way when it becomes that cancerous mass. It almost like circles around and becomes satanic. Like it becomes the unholy.
Right. You'll have new icons, new saints, new liturgies, new taboos.
Absolutely. And you see that manifesting itself on the radical left side.
Right. That are not rational. No.
So can I just, the one thing I want to bring up in terms of the tabernacle that we haven't mentioned yet, which I think is important, is the notion of the cherub. And I think, to me, the cherub is important for me because we also have to understand that this order that's set up also has something like the fringe on the edge. And that fringe on the edge will be represented in several ways in the Bible as an actual fringe on vestments. There are different ways, or as the corner of the fields that should not be tilled. There are different ways to represent it. And the cherub we represent the cherub often as this nice little angel. Imagine Indiana Jones, it's like all these classical angels. But the description of the cherub in Scripture is that it is a hybrid. It is a mixture of usually of a lion, a bull, an eagle, and a man in different ways, either with four faces or sometimes with parts of the body. So
it's a monstrous chimera.
It's a chimera. It looks more like a sphinx.
So like the vision of Ezekiel.
Yes, right. It's a good example of that. And so it's like, so what is going on? Why is that? And it has to do with the edge. That's why the cherub is placed on the outside of the Garden of Eden and is like a transition, a guardian between the inside and the outside. And the place that is between the inside and the outside is the thing that has a confused identity. That is what it is. And so it has a function in the whole cosmos, this notion of something which is a mixture, which is many things at the same time, but it is on the edge all the time. So you see it as
it can't be made central.
No.
Because the central thing isn't a chimera.
And so you see it as a fractal, like in this part, you have it on the veils, of the different veils of the tabernacle, and then finally on the inside, even in the holiest place, it becomes the lower support, like the seat, you could say, for the glory of God to kind of manifest itself on or behind. So it
What's called the mercy seat. There's a reason for that.
hides because it's not of the identity. So it's like that's what you can understand a veil that way. It's like
guarding,
this intermediary space.
It's almost guarding like a gargoyle. And
That's what gargoyles are.
So
the same
you-
thing. If
and
you want to
you-
understand gargoyles, the cherub is already there in Scripture.
We've talked about before that there's two versions of the monstrous that has to be kept at the fringe. One is too much sameness, right, and the other is too much of the chaotic thrown together, the monstrous chimera, right? They're different, but they guard from different things.
Identity and diversity.
Yeah, and so that's a guard. Like, don't go beyond
Tyrannical unity and diversity.
There are two excesses. One which would be excess unity, and you will see
That's
some
no
of that.
fringe allowed. Right?
Exactly.
Excess
And we'll
unity
see
is
some
no
of that
fringe allowed.
in the story. The story of Miriam and the Ethiopian wife, I think, has to do with that exactly. Where it's like she's insisting on too much purity. And so because of that, it's actually funny, I think, in the text, her skin becomes white like snow. And she's objecting to Moses having a darker wife, you could say. And she becomes like too white. It's not framed in racial. It's not a racial question, but it's an idea of being too pure, you could say, so that you can't function inside the system.
But so this is you're saying the tabernacle, right? There's echoes of Garden of Eden. There's echoes of creation, right? It's the point. It's the meeting point of everything that we're saying. And so what the gargoyle is guarding is, I'm already a composite of various things. Go beyond me, and the center won't hold, right?
Yeah, it's the edge, right? It's the thing on the edge, right?
Right.
Exactly.
Well, it's part of the problem of categorization per se, because we like to think that the way we make a category is we have a list of features, and everything in that category has that list of features and no other features. And none of our categories are like that, except there are categories called proper sets, like triangles, where you can exactly define what's in the category and what isn't. But hardly any categories are like that. Most of our categories have an ideal at the center, and then there's a bunch of other categories. And so that brings up the problem of, well, what exists at the margin of the category? Because you can't just make a qualitative shift from one category to another. And the answer is, well, the ideal that's the central point of the perception, even the enabling precondition for the perception, is that there's an ideal at the center, but there is a fringe of things that are sort of like that. And it's an inevitable consequence of having a category that works because it's united by an ideal, but that's still practically flexible enough to operate in the real world. It has to have a fringe. And so, it's very useful to think about that in terms of tolerance too, because you could put forward an ideal, and maybe this is a mediating principle that helps us deal with the judgmental quality of the ideal. It's like, well, who can stand against the ideal? And the answer is no one. Well, you soften the ideal by having a fringe around it, and you say, well, maybe we have a concept of an ideal family, but almost no one's family makes itself manifest as that ideal. Well, do we judge everyone harshly and throw them into a pit? The answer is no. We maintain the ideal, but we also note that there's a wide fringe around that ideal that needs to be accepted as part of the category, even though it's got a monstrous nature. And what's the relationship between the cherubim and the mercy seat in the Ark of the Covenant?
Well, the cherubim guard the mercy seat. It's not totally clear.
Is that
it's
because
not totally clear what the mercy seat is.
Well, if it's associated with the idea of mercy, is it the notion that even the monstrous has a place? Is it something like that?
I mean, it's acting as a guard. So that's the way to understand it. It's acting as a buffer. It's acting as something which is guarding the improper from entering. So I think you just have to see as a fractal. Think of the Garden of Eden. It's like the guard, you get chased out of the garden. There's the cherubim on the edge, protecting the garden. So now it's represented several times in the very text. It's on the veils and then represented again fractally in the.
I see.
In the
So
middle.
you think it's an echo of the idea of the cherubim that are guarding the gates of paradise?
Yeah, it's
So going
100%
back
sure.
in is
There's no doubt around that.
reconciliation and in reverse.
Okay.
Did
Well,
you
that's
ask
so interesting.
Did you pose the rhetorical question? Are monsters real? Was
Yeah,
that
for
one
sure
of the
monsters
things
are real.
that you, Jordan, just said? Something to the effect of maybe the monstrous is real, or something to that effect?
Well, the monstrous is definitely real.
Right. So I just want to offer a very, I don't know if the word is cute, but I think an interesting little anecdote. So when my older son was about 5 or 6, it was a difficult period because his mother and I had just divorced, and he was walking around the house with a sort of mop handle or broom handle, battling monsters. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I was right to this day, whether it was related to anything he was going through with regard to the divorce, if he was going through anything at all. He was so young when his mother and I separated. But nevertheless, he was killing monsters. And he looked at me and he said, "So, Dad, are monsters real?" Mm-hmm. And I went through this incredibly fast debate. If I say yes, he'll be scared. But if I say no, mm-hmm. I'm lying to him. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I said, "Yes, monsters are real." And he stopped immediately. There was no more killing monsters.
So I had this little cousin, this little.
Very interesting. As the father of very active children, my youngest quite often is fighting and imaginary sort of stuff, but also not just fully imaginary, but stuff he sees in movies. So we watched some of the Avengers movies, and he was battling Thanos continuously for a couple of days. But I wouldn't answer that question in that way. Even to my 5-year-old, I'd probably say something like, monsters are real in a certain way, but aren't real in another way. And then I'll try to explain that a little bit as to what I'm talking about. Like, what do we mean by real? I feel like Jordan Peterson's going to go into this, like, what do we mean by real? You know, what is real? It's complicated. It's real thing.
Nephew of mine, he was having terrors at night. He was waking up screaming at night regularly. He was about 4. And during the day, he was running around with a night hat on and a sword, and he'd go to sleep with this. And one day, I was over at his parents' house when he was having these night terrors, and one day he woke up, and I was watching him zip about. And there was a fair bit of trouble in the family at that point, by the way. And I asked him, he recounted a dream at the breakfast table, and he said, it's been a long time since I remembered this, he said, he was out in the middle of the field, and there was all these beaked dwarves that were jumping up at him and biting him. And so they only came up to his knees, and he said they were covered with hair and then a cross shaved on the top of their head, sort of greasy hair. And they were biting him, and there was hordes of them, and he was trying to battle off all of these dwarfs, these horrible dwarfs. And then he looked in the background, and he could see a dragon in the background, and the dragon was breathing out smoke, and the smoke was turning into these dwarves. And so this is such a brilliant image, because he's being beset by a multitude of problems, and then there's a monstrous form in the background that's generating the forms. And I said, and this was purposeful, I said, what could you do about that? And he kind of lit up. It was so interesting because everybody at the table was just absolutely transfixed by this dream that this 4-year-old had had. It's like, whoa, you know. And so he said, I would get my dad. I would take my sword and I would go poke out the eyes of the dragon, and then I would go down into its belly, I'd go down its throat, and I would find the box where the fire came out, and I would cut open the box to destroy it. I'd make myself a shield out of the box. And I thought, oh my God, kid, that's so brilliant. But it was so interesting because by asking him what he would do about it, I suggested to him that he could take arm against a sea of troubles, right? And then this whole mythological story just snapped into his imagination. And you might say, well, where did it come from? I mean, he'd watched Disney movies, and his parents had read all sorts of stories to him, and he was already running around like a little knight. But you think he got this whole story is that you go right into the belly of the beast, right down into the darkest place where the fire itself emerges, and it's out of that you forge a shield. And this is God's honest truth. And I asked his mother repeatedly after that. He never had another episode of night terrors in his life. And it's because he catalyzed identification with the hero. And then you say, well, does the monstrous exist? There's a little kid's book that I used to read to my undergraduates called There's No Such Thing as a Dragon. And I look at dragon. There's a great book on dragons. Dragon is tree, cat, snake, bird. They're all classic primate predators. And what a dragon is an amalgam of predation itself. And so you might say, well, there's no such thing as a dragon. It's like, all right, smarty pants, is there such a thing as a predator? It's like, well, yes. It's like predator, dragon, same word. A predator is an amalgam of the features of specific predators. And so a monster, a dragon, is the predator as such. And part of the human religious enterprise is to determine what stance to take, not to a predator, but to the predator as such. And then it's not only...
For those who don't know, my youngest kid's name is Vahagan. It means dragon slayer, dragon reaper, serpent killer. It's any one of those are a fair translation of it. I've sort of done this to him as well, in the sense of like he's regularly fighting dragons, almost always fighting dragons. He went to some kind of a theme thing. One of our friends took him, and there's a dragon there, and he took out his dagger and he stabbed it. I have a picture of it. It's hilarious. He's always fighting dragons.
The dragon, as a biological entity, a predatory bird, a cat, a snake, something that breathes fire. But it's even more than that, because it's elevated up into something satanic. Because the worst predator isn't just the predator of the body. The worst predator is the predator of the spirit. And so all of that's predicated on the idea that there is such a thing as monsters, and that we can take the proper stance in relationship to them. That's
think of the child, though,
George.
like in terms of this story. Think of what he did. He went into the monster, he turned the monster into a shield. That's the exact image we have in the text, which is that the hybrid acts as a shield. In its proper function, acts as a shield between things. And the gargoyle plays the same function on a church. It's like this outer monster, it gets turned, it becomes a...
Okay, so why is it a shield? Why is the monstrous precisely a shield? I can understand
Because
it as a border image.
Inoculation.
So, yeah, so but it's the border. There you go. Yeah, that's right, that's right.
It's the staff with the...
Yeah, what has to
snake.
do with the serpent.
It's very interesting that they've been talking for about an hour, and I think the last time Oz Guinness spoke has been like an hour and 10 minutes ago.
As well.
You wisely avoided the word vaccination.
I paused. I was like, what company am I with? Who's sitting around this table with me?
Yeah.
So you think the monstrous gives you an opportunity to practice that courageous advance?
Yes, G.K. Chesterton has a line somewhere where he says something like, the point of the story of St. George and the dragon is not to convince children that dragons are real, but that dragons can be defeated.
Right,
Oh,
right.
I like
Yeah,
that.
to convince children that they
Yes.
can embody
G.K. Chesterton for the win.
the spirit of St. George.
I should read St. George and the Dragon to my son. Good idea.
Yes, definitely, definitely.
We mock them at our peril. There's
Well,
stories.
look. One of the things we know from the psychotherapeutic endeavor of the past 100 years is that if you invite people to take the stance of courageous approach to those things that they're afraid of or disgusted by, both, because it works for obsessive compulsive disorder as well, if you can put them in proper relationship to those things, which is courageous advance, they don't get less afraid. They get braver, and that generalizes. And that's a universal, what would you say? That's a universal emergent observation across classes of psychotherapeutic practice. So the Freudians will re-expose people to their childhood traumas, for example, voluntarily. And the behaviorists will just take you out and have you confront as much as you can something that you're afraid of. And that catalyzes a process of psychological transformation that generalizes. You get braver. You develop a
So
more...
where is this nonsense in our society about safety come
It's
from?
the fact that psychologists aren't up in arms about this very thing
Great
is an
point.
indication of
That
the
is great.
immense terror and cowardice that the
Yeah,
whole enterprise is
right.
now laboring under. Because one thing every single psychotherapist worth his or her salt knows is that you do not protect people from what they're afraid of. You find the edge, you find the monstrous edge, and you invite them to participate in dancing on that edge, and that's curative.
You know, the prudishness around art, bizarrely coming from the left now, right, is somebody where, like the left, it should be when they're burning copies of Ulysses show up with buckets of water. But it's a similar concern of constraining this prudishness of the hybridization in some way. Because the artists are another version of the hybrid. You have a David Bowie, you have a Prince, you have people from the outside who are moderating and interpreting the chaos and the unknown through a form that then is more pleasing. But you don't want to go to a concert and see 40 princes. You don't want to sit in a classroom with 40 princes. The point of Prince is he was Prince.
To be on the free. Well,
right, that's the point of it. So if we start to hammer everything into shape and with too much sameness, which is the other side of too much hybridization, both poles contain
the fringe
alarms.
the fringe loses its utility. I mean, one of the arguments that I read that was quite compelling from the gay community itself against the idea of gay marriage was that if you move the fringe to the center, all the utility of the fringe disappears. And there's utility, there's special utility in the fringe, but it is utility of exceptionality. It's not utility of inclusiveness. And the other problem, too, is if you move the fringe to the center, you're faced with a problem that turns out, boys and girls, the fringe has fringes. And so you think you've got a fringe to deal with when the center is the center. You wait till the fringe is the center, and then you're going to see Ontario school teachers with 78 quadruple D breasts and gigantic nipples going to shop class.
And not in a good way.
Right? Exactly.
This point was so beautiful. I don't want to let it go because it's so helpful to people about the safety god, so to speak, of our time. I have this great, it's a gift of my life, 40 years of talk radio, because I talk not to, but with so many people. So when I talk about this subject, I'll never forget a woman called, said, Dennis, I really want to travel. I envy you. You've gone to all these countries, but I'm just afraid. I'm petrified about flying. What should I do? And I said, fly. The only possible way to get rid of that fear is to get on an airplane. If you have to take 3 people you love with you, take 3 people you love with you. If you have to take a sedative, take a sedative, but you have to fly. I learned this when I was a kid. My older brother, and for many kids, the older brother is godlike. And he was godlike. He was 6 years older than me. And I told him I was really scared of horror movies, monster movies, horror movies. And I don't know where he came up with it. He said, watch them until one day you're just going to say, boy, they really did a good job with the costumes and the makeup. And that's exactly what happened. And that's the message.
I should clarify a point. It's not safety god. It's safety goddess, and it's the devouring mother, right? And the safety goddess that's the devouring mother is then the predator. But then that's the predator. Because if you're the person who insists that everything be made as safe as possible, you are now the snake in the garden.
Such a bad idea.
I think also we, in this political discussion around this, which it consolidates to right away, we get so lost in content. And so much of it is like, what is the process by which aspects of the fringe rightly move to the center?
Mm-hmm.
And that tends to be a moral and righteous engagement that has aspects that are sacrificial, civil rights movement, maybe Stonewall, Harvey Milk. There's a negotiation with the public in a way where aspects of what are considered the fringe are rightly brought in, I think rightly, brought in towards the center. It can't occur from a position of screaming and temper tantrums. The engagement of that process has to be one that's negotiated.
Do you think that's associated with the idea that in the holiest place you have a place of tradition and a place of sacrifice? Because it sort of implies that the tradition is sacrosanct and sacred, but the tradition is also stone, right? It doesn't move. And that's actually the problem with tradition, because the future changes. And so the fringe does have to be incorporated in a transformative way into the center, and it's sacrifice that enables that to occur, right? I mean,
it's armor, right? Armor protects you but limits your flexibility. And there's certain negotiations that have been successful. We're not going to say, when you're talking about this teacher, we don't have that conversation anymore about certain groups who we all accept. I mean, even the differences between us sitting at this table. There's groups, there's a process by which there's a righteous negotiation, but the negotiation has to mean that you are taking on the burden of whatever the punishment is for your perceived transgressions to the society. And you're doing it in such righteous fashion that the onslaught that comes against you reveals itself as injustice.
Well,
that's been dealt with.
That doesn't answer the question of the central principle that's at stake, however. I mean,
there's a version of, in the scripture, and even in the story that's coming, we probably won't be able to deal with it. There are some versions of how the fringe gets integrated into the center. The most easiest one to understand is the story of Ruth, where you have a stranger who is integrated into the land, who's integrated into the people. And the way it happens is that your God will be my God. That's how it works. And there's another version
she first says your people will be my people.
That's right.
Your people will be
so the idea is that it's like I am actually going to join with you. Like I'm actually going to recognize the highest ideal as the same and participate in the body. And so it's like I'm spoiling this story. Sorry. It's like when we get to the promised land and you have only 2 people left from this entire group that enter into the promised land. One of the versions of that is that one of those 2 is a Kenizzite. He's possibly not even Hebrew. And he gets the fringe of the land. They'd say that he gets the border of the camp. And so you have Joshua, who is the savior and who is the central part, and then you have the outside. And one reading of his name, Caleb, is a dog, actually. And so it's like you have the outside and the inside, and they're all integrated together. It's possible, but for that to happen, it has to be real. It has to be.
It also has to be subservience to the system, right? I mean, when you talk about movement with regard to the ark, for example, in this particular story, there is movement to the ark. In fact, one of the most interesting things about the ark is that the staves that are put there to carry it are never to be removed, right? You're never supposed to take them out. Theoretically, you could take them out, and then you could replace them every time you wanted to move the ark, and that's what you would normally do if you were building something and then you were going to leave it there for a while, not knowing when you were going to do it next. You would take out the staves, you'd put them in the closet somewhere, you take them back, but you're not allowed in the biblical text to actually remove the staves because the ark could theoretically be moving any time, right? I mean, the idea is that where God tells you to go, you go. But the actual interior contents of the ark and the composition of the ark itself, the eternal principles, are unchanging. You're going to take those principles into foreign lands, and you're going to take them into wilderness, and you're going to take them to places you don't understand. You can't let those places change the interior content. Right, that's why they're stone. That's why they're made of gold. They're made of unchangeable materials.
Gold is better than stone in terms of unchangeability. It's the ultimate unchangeable material.
Do you want to comment on the vestments, and we can close with that for today?
Yeah, we could. I mean, the vestments, I don't know if there's someone else wants to talk about the vestments.
I have one quick word to say.
Yes,
not about vestments as a general rule and the Torah's preoccupation with the right ones. This is is the word hobby horse. This is a passion of mine. Again, it's our age of complete secularization and is related to the absence of the belief that clothing is important. Beginning, for example, with the idiocy that kids do not need dress codes in schools. Every study, and I'm not a study fan because I have a motto, studies either confirm what common sense suggests or they're wrong. But in any event, study after study shows kids with dress codes have less violence in schools, their grades improve, they respect their teachers more. And likewise that the teacher has a dress code. Clothing is critical. And we have lost that sense. And I know many of my listeners, and as Larry Arnn sweetly said, even supporters are Christian. And I think my biggest single difference with them is not a Jewish-Christian difference. It's a clothing at church difference. I say it matters what you wear at church, and then Christian after Christian calls my show and said, God doesn't care what I wear. And That's why this text is so important. God does care what you wear. Where did you get the notion God doesn't care what you wear to church or even non-church?
It's an incomplete celebration if you don't pay some attention to how you're comporting yourself, how you're presenting yourself.
Yes.
At least it's the deviation from an ideal. If you're going to go to do something ideal, you might as well. So I'll tell you something that happened to me. This is quite remarkable, I suppose. Before I went on tour the first time, I gave some thought about what I was going to wear. Now, my father was a school teacher, and he always wore a suit. And this was in the late 60s and early 70s. And I asked him one day when I was a kid, and he said it was a mark of respect for the students. And that really struck me, and because he always put on a suit. And my dad's an outdoor sort of guy. Like, he's not a suit sort of guy, fundamentally. And so when I went to Harvard to teach, I wasn't much older than my students, somewhat, but not markedly. And so one of the things I did was to dress quite formally, and that put up a distinction between me and my students, which was actually, it made things easier for them because that formality made it actually easier for them to interact with me. And so I started to pay some attention to that. And I always wore suits when I lectured at Harvard. I even toyed with wearing my robes at one point. That didn't work because that's so archaic. No one even knew what I was doing. But when I went out on tour, I decided I would go and get some really good suits. And I went to a tailor and I got some really nice suits and I spent a tremendous amount of money on them. It just shocked me to death. But I thought, look, I'm going out on this multi-city tour. I'm going to do absolutely 100% everything that's under my control to make it work. So I bought these suits, and turned out I liked them. But one of the things that was so cool, I didn't expect this at all, is that about half of the people who come to my lectures dress up. The men, lots of them tell me, the young guys, they say, this is the first time I've ever, and they have three-piece suits on. They say, this is the first time I've ever bought a suit. I bought a suit for this lecture.
For the show, wow.
For the yeah, and now, the last tour I was on was 4 years after the first tour, and a lot more of the people who came were couples. And a lot of them are dressed up, so it's like a wedding. It's so fun, and to see these people, these young people, like they're dressed up, they put forward their best foot, you know? And what's so interesting about it is they're all excited about it, right? Because they don't have an opportunity anymore to put their best foot forward and are never rewarded for it. But I never envisioned at all that the decision that I made, you know, to put on these suits and to pay some attention to vestments, let's say, would have this distributed effect that's been quite pronounced and quite remarkable. And it also makes the events themselves, in a real sense, more civilized. Because everyone's there, like they're trying to look their best, and they're trying to look their best because they're actually trying to do their best. And that means the outer clothing matches the inner orientation, and that's part of having the proper vestments, and that brings us back to the high priest's garment. So
the only thing I can say is that pretty much everything we've explored until now is now gathered again into the priest's vestment. And so you really have to understand it in this fractal system as microcosms within microcosms. And so the priest is a microcosm of Israel. He is Israel contained into one person, and the way that his vestment is made is the same. You know when I said the heaven is round and the earth is square? Well, that's how his vestment is made. He has a mitre or a turban. He has a round thing on the top of his head, and on his forehead it says, Holy to the Lord. And then on his breast he has a square with the 12 tribes of Israel. And on his shoulders, he has the sons of Israel. So you could say, what's the difference between the two? And you can see it as this corollary, as this promise, right? So it's like from heaven above descends the covenant, the promise, and it separates into the sons of Israel, and then it joins together into the breastplate, which has 12 stones, which are engraved with the names of Israel. So that's the best way to maybe understand it, is that once again, and if you
that's a subsidiary hierarchy right there.
And if you understand, it's hard because we don't have the full picture, but if you understand that the tabernacle it wasn't just the tabernacle, that the tabernacle was set up, and the tribes were set up all around as this massive square. And so it's like this is now gathered all the way back into the high priest, who kind of carries that into the holiest place. So the subsidiary structure is there the whole way through.
And there's a fringe on the edges of the vestments as well.
Well, I think that's a pretty good analysis. He's paying attention to details that matter.
There's the bells,
And for Dennis, there's also undergarments, which say made from linen, covering the naked flesh from the hips to the thighs, so the high priest doesn't bear guilt in the holy place and die.
But there's also
the Dennis Prager line of undergarments coming soon.
That's important, by the way, in that they're covering their nakedness, if we would put it that way. Their privates are covered. That gets mentioned quite a bit.
There's a relationship between the different garments, because there is a wool garment as well, because there's a law that says you don't mix linen and you don't mix linen and wool. It's very important because it has to do with this hybrid problem, which is mixing categories together. But if they're properly ordered, then you see it. So he's representing the veils of the temple themselves, because in the temple there's a linen veil and a wool veil. Then his vestment is linen with wool, and so it's all this amazing microcosm bringing it all together into the.
By the way, talking about undergarments, the Mormons are mocked for their undergarment by the anti-religious. And whenever I hear their mockery, which makes me sick, I actually respect the Mormons for doing it. I think they don't know that Jews do that. With the tzitzit, the fringes that religious Jews wear under their garment. And sometimes you even see the fringes exposed. But it's interesting that they would mock Why would they just not ignore it? It's almost as if they understand anything that represents the holy just needs to be destroyed. The nihilism may not be conscious, but it is present.
So when it comes to the breastplate, a quick note on that. I mean, when we were talking about diversity inside unity, I mean, that's really what the breastplate represents. And you know, again, the subsidiarity of the Bible, moving from the story of family to the story of tribes to the story of a whole nation. But the tribes aren't dissolved, right? When they move up the hierarchy, it's not as though the tribes cease to be. I mean, they end up with the ancestral land in the land of Israel, and you end up having all sorts of commandments that have to do with the return of ancestral land over the 49th year. It goes back to the tribe. There are intermarriage rules within the tribes as to how the land stays within its boundaries. And this is really important stuff, particularly in a time where universalistic ideologies tend to predominate. The idea that there must be one rule for everyone. It has to be crammed down with equal alacrity at every single level of government. And that's such a mistake.
Homogeneity.
Yeah, exactly. The homogeneity. And you see it, I mean, that exists all the way from sort of, I would say, radical libertarian right, which sort of suggests that there should be no rules all the way top, all the way to the bottom, to the communist systems, which suggests there should be a set of very arcane rules that are applied by the top to the very bottom. But that's not how the system was meant to be, because we have different levels of loyalty that rise up the chain. And in the end, what makes us all part of the same breastplate is what goes on the Kohen Gadol, the high priest's headdress, which is that we're holy to God. But it's, again, holy to God, unity underneath that hierarchical purpose allows you to be part of the same breastplate, but you don't disappear into the unity. You don't disappear into the homogeneity. You still have loyalty at lower levels.
So
say something about the Urim and Thummim, because the Urim is later.
Okay, hang on. Larry had a comment, and then we'll turn to that and close with that.
This is an extraordinary community with a universal God and particular rules for it, and the rules are contrived to preserve the community, including in its tribes, which is how you inherit all that. So that's, in other words, you guys don't like the word rational as much as I do, but that's rational. That makes sense, right?
Well, again, I think that the rational very often, I mean, Hayek would say this, right? The rational is very often reflective of traditional wisdom, and traditional wisdom is reflective. Yeah, exactly. It's more emergent than it is somebody sat down and constructed the system. They recognize what worked, and traditional wisdom is a form of data. And so the fact that this has worked historically and been embodied by Judaism, embodied in subsidiary in the Catholic Church, been embodied throughout human history, the fact that, again, it's now being kind of thrown out in favor of grand schemes for all of humanity that ought to be crammed down from the top level on downward, it's extraordinarily dangerous, and it's why when you see sort of the push now against nations, right, nationalism.
So I think it's a bad understanding of what unity looks like. People think unity is uniformity. It's being the same, and it's not. Unity in the truest sense is having diversity within it, and still having a overarching higher principle or commitment or idea that you're committed and bound by without losing your individuality.
Is bad. Nationalism is not bad. Nationalism can be bad, but it doesn't have to be bad.
It's bad when it takes the highest place.
Right, exactly. Localism is not bad. Right? I mean, these are all things that can be very good, as long as, again, there's a series of hierarchically designated goals that aim toward the top.
It's bad when it moves to the monstrous too muchness on the other end from the chimera and the gargoyles. That's where it gets bad. But there's a whole rich ground in the middle, right, where those things can flourish.
Well, when Adam is enjoined to subdue the world in the Garden of Eden, and subdue means to put everything in its proper place, right? And so the idea is, and this should appeal to Larry, is that if you implement the proper rational order, the rationality is part of the fact that everything is given its proper due, and that's also part of the process of proper naming. Everything in its proper place. Yeah. And if it's in its proper place, it has the right value. And so if the nation becomes God like it did under Hitler, then it's satanic. Yeah. But if it's in its proper place, and that would be subordinate to an order that transcends the national, then it can be a virtuous enterprise, just like the family can be as well.
You can always recognize that when the system becomes problematic, you can recognize it. It's very simple. If the levels try to compete with each other, that's when it's a problem. So if the higher levels try to eliminate the lower levels, like the community and all these things, then you know something's wrong. If the individual tries to become God and to claim all right to name himself and to just self-exist, then you see that it's wrong. And you can, so it's the inversion. It always has to do. It's like things just have to exist at their level. They have their reason for being. And when they start to compete with the others, it's either revolution or tyranny.
See, and that's I always think of the great chain of being in relation to Shakespeare, right? And so in Macbeth, you have the emergence of the witches, the emergence of the grotesque, like tear that contract, break the great chain of being, right? With
those are the witches that you don't suffer to live. Right, right. Which we talked about yesterday.
The world opens up.
So do you want to just? So this is like throwing a bomb into the table, though.
No, let's leave that.
You want to talk about that tomorrow?
We should leave that because we've hit our 2-hour mark, and I think this is a good place to close. So let's open with that tomorrow. And so for everyone who's watching and listening, this has been episode 12 of the Exodus seminars, and we've done a good job now, or at least as thorough job as we could manage, of walking through the commandments and then differentiating them into the, or analyzing their differentiation into the particularized law, and then associating that today with the particularization of place and worship and ritual. And so tomorrow we'll move to the golden calf and progress on through Exodus. And as we progress forward, just so everyone knows, we're going to pull in some of the narrative elements from some of the later books of the Torah that pertain on the continuing adventures of the Israelites in the desert. And so, gentlemen, thank you very much for your participation today. To everyone watching and listening, thank you for your time and attention. To the Daily Wire Plus people who have endeavored to make this all possible and to bring it to a public audience, thanks to all. And so that's it for episode 12. Welcome, Greg and Ben. We're thrilled to have you here, and thanks for your contributions today. Oh, and we're going to lose Larry tomorrow, right? So
I will miss you all.
We'll miss you too. And thank you very much for being part of this. And so hopefully we'll be able to do something akin to this again. Many things akin to this in the future as we conspire together. Right. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for another study, even though I would say this is probably one of my least liked studies. Not because of the text, because of how much they went off track and sort of ignored the actual text. That's partly why. So, hey, there's 10 of you guys in here. I can hit that like button. I was like sitting there. I'm like, I got about 3 minutes. I can do this in. Thank you, guys. You know, as we were going through this, and it was kind of a drag for me today, but I was looking at the numbers and the consistency of you guys that have been watching this the entire time that this stream has been going on. I just want to share my appreciation for you that you actually think my opinions matter on stuff that really, really smart dudes have to say. Especially on the Bible. So I appreciate you guys giving me that kind of a place. Apologia Center, when is your next Exodus stream? Because I've fallen behind. I've asked myself that question. Carl, I might do it Wednesday. If I don't do another one Wednesday, I might just leave it for next Monday. Am I here next Monday? What's next Monday? Yes, I am. So yeah, I might do one Wednesday, like in the afternoon, maybe earlier. I'm trying to see if I can develop a stream around 12 o'clock on Wednesdays. And if I do that, then that'll be it. And if not, then we'll be on the 6th. I'm gonna try to catch up. Okay. Again, thank you guys for hanging out. Appreciate it. I will see you guys tomorrow. We'll have a stream tomorrow. We just hit, I think, what did we just hit? We just hit a certain number. That was unique, I guess. 4,880. That's the amount of subscribers we had, is 4,880. I have a goal that we're going to hit 5,000 by the end of the year. And I think we'll hit that number. So we will see how that goes. But with all that said, thank you guys. God bless you. And I will see you guys tomorrow.